The late afternoon sun poured liquid gold over the Pike Ranch, a light so thick and heavy it seemed to pool in the hollows of the land. It clung to the dry blades of foxtail grass, turning them into a shimmering, pale sea. A wind, born somewhere in the vast, arid expanse to the west, carried the scent of dust, sun-baked leather, and the faint, sweet perfume of decay from the weathered fence posts that leaned like tired old men against the weight of the sky. The road, little more than a pair of ruts carved into the earth, was a ribbon of fine powder that rose in lazy clouds with every gust, coating everything in a uniform layer of beige. This was a place shaped by sun and wind, a landscape that demanded resilience and offered little in return but the stark, uncompromising beauty of survival. At the gate stood Maribel Sloane. At 28, she carried herself with a stillness that life had forced upon her long before her time. Her dress, a simple, homespun garment the color of a butterfly's wing after a rainstorm, was practical and clean, though the hem was frayed and stained with the dust of a long journey. In one hand, she held a worn leather satchel containing all her worldly possessions, a few medical texts, a slate and chalk, a change of clothes, and a small, cloth-wrapped box she never opened in the company of others. Her face was framed by dark hair pulled back severely, but a few rebellious strands had escaped to curl around her temples. It was her eyes. However, that told her story. They were the deep, clear gray of a morning sky, and in their depths was the unmistakable shadow of loss, a quiet grief that had settled deep in her bones. Yet, beneath that shadow, a flicker of light remained, a resilient, unwavering flame that refused to be extinguished. She was a traveling teacher, a self-taught nurse, a woman who had learned to mend what was broken, be it a child's slate or a ranch hand's fractured bone. She had come here seeking not a home, but a harbor, a temporary respite from a world that had taken too much. The sound of footsteps on the porch drew her attention. They were heavy, measured, the sound of boots that had walked 1,000 hard miles. Rowan Pike emerged from the shadows of the house, pausing on the top step. He was a man carved from the very land he worked. His shoulders were broad, straining the seams of his faded chambray shirt, and his skin was burned the color of rich earth from years under the unforgiving sun. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, were large and calloused, tools made for mending fences and calming frightened livestock. He was not a handsome man in the way of city folk, but there was a raw, solid strength to him that was more compelling than any polished feature. He looked at Maribel, his eyes a placid, unreadable shade of brown, yet she could see the weariness etched at their corners, a fatigue that went deeper than a single day's labor. He carried the silence of the plains within him, a man accustomed to the company of his own thoughts. A burst of laughter, thin and bright as birdsong, erupted from the direction of the barn. 4 small figures were caught in a whirlwind of dust and sunlight near the corral. The eldest, a boy of about 11 with a serious face and a protective stance, was Tanner. He stood slightly apart, watching the others with the gravity of a miniature adult. A girl of 8, Lark, with hair the color of wheat and a delicate, sensitive face, was trying to coax a kitten from beneath a water trough. The source of the most motion was Bo, a 5-year-old tornado of energy, his face smudged with dirt and his laughter booming with fearless joy. And then there was the smallest, Renly, a toddler of 3 who sat contentedly in the dirt, clutching a doll made from a wooden spool and a scrap of calico, its face a blank canvas for her imagination. They were a constellation of childhood, bright and chaotic against the somber backdrop of the ranch. Maribel took a steadying breath, the dusty air scratching at her throat, and opened the gate. Its hinges groaned in protest. She walked toward the porch, her steps deliberate, feeling Rowan Pike's gaze follow her every move. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, forcing herself to meet his quiet, assessing stare. Mr. Pike, she began, her voice clearer than she expected. My name is Maribel Sloane. I was told in Sagebrush Hollow that you might have need of a teacher for your children. Rowan didn't move, He just watched her, his expression unchanging. "We manage," he said. The words were not unkind, merely a statement of fact. "I'm sure you do," Maribel replied, refusing to be deterred. "But children need their letters and numbers. It's a foundation they'll need for whatever world comes after this one." She gestured to the vast, empty horizon. "I don't ask for much. A roof over my head, a plate at your table, and whatever chores you see fit to give me. In exchange, I will see to their education. And," she added, her gaze softening as she glanced toward the barn, "I have some skill with nursing. I can mend cuts and soothe fevers." He was silent for a long moment. The only sounds, the whisper of the wind and the distant, happy shrieks of his children. His eyes seemed to look right through her, searching for something she couldn't name. Then he spoke, his voice low and direct, the question landing with the force of a physical blow. "You ever had children of your own, Miss Sloane?" The air thickened, pressing in on her. The world seemed to stop. The wind died. The laughter from the barn faded into a dull hum in her ears. It was a question that sliced through all pretense, a simple, brutal inquiry that laid bare the rawest wound in her soul. She could feel the ghost of a tiny hand in hers, the memory of a weight in her arms that was no longer there. For a moment, her throat closed, and the carefully constructed walls around her heart threatened to crumble. She could lie. She could offer a vague, respectable story of a husband lost to fever, of a life that might have been, but looking into Rowan Pike's tired, honest eyes, she found she could not. A lie would be an insult to the life he was living, to the memory she carried. She swallowed, the sound loud in the sudden stillness. "I cannot have children, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice a near whisper, but unwavering. The words hung between them, stark and irrevocable. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "A fever took my daughter, Elodie, 2 winters ago, and it took from me the ability to ever have another." She paused, letting the truth settle. "But I know how to care for them. I know how to love them as if they were my own. I know their hurts and their fears. I know how to be a mother." Something shifted in Rowan Pike's face. It was not pity. It was something closer to recognition, a shared understanding of loss that needed no further words. The hard line of his mouth softened. Just for an instant, and the barest hint of a smile touched his lips, a flicker of warmth in the cool brown of his eyes. "Good," he said, the single word a quiet acceptance. "There are more than enough children here for the both of us." He turned without another word and descended the steps, his boots thudding against the dry wood. He expected her to follow, and she did, her heart a wild, uncertain drum against her ribs. She had passed some unspoken test. Maribel followed him across the yard, the sun beating down on the corrugated tin roof of the main house, reflecting a blinding glare. As they walked, her senses took in the details of this place, piecing together the story of the Pike family. Her mind's eye, a lens honed by years of observation, panned across the evidence of a life built on necessity and hard work. Near the back door stood a small sewing table, a half-mended pair of boys' trousers draped over a chair, the needle still threaded and stuck in the rough denim. A collection of saddles sat on a rail, their leather cracked and dark with sweat, each one telling a story of long days and tired muscles. A black iron kettle sat on the cold stove just inside the open kitchen door, waiting for the fire that would signal the end of the day. This was not a place of comfort, but of function. Every object had a purpose. Every repair was a small victory against the relentless forces of wear and tear. As they neared the barn, the children fell silent, 4 pairs of eyes fixed on her, wide with a raw, unfiltered curiosity. Tanner's gaze was the most intense, a silent appraisal that seemed to weigh her worth. Lark peeked out from behind her brother's legs, her expression wary and timid. Bo, bold as brass, simply stared, a smudge of dirt highlighting the curve of his cheek. Only little Renly seemed unconcerned, her attention returning quickly to the fascinating texture of her spool doll. They were like a herd of wild foals, beautiful and untamed, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Then, as if a spell had been broken, they turned away, their focus shifting back to their dusty, sun-drenched games, leaving Maribel feeling like an intruder in their tightly knit world. Rowan led her into the main house. It was a simple, two-room structure, clean but sparse. A long wooden table dominated the main room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and soap. He gestured toward a small alcove off the main room, barely large enough for a narrow cot and a small chest. "You can have this," he said. "It's not much." "It's more than enough," Maribel assured him, placing her satchel on the cot. "Thank you." Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she noticed something on the wall beside the cot. Hanging from a small wooden peg was a child's shawl. It was knitted from soft, fine wool, the color of a pale spring sky, and edged with a delicate lace pattern. It was too small for any of the children she had seen outside. It was the size for a baby, an infant. It hung next to the empty space where a cradle might have once stood. It was a ghost in the room, a silent testament to another loss, another empty space in this family's life. Without thinking, Maribel reached out, her fingers brushing against the soft wool. A tremor ran through her, a deep, resonant pang of shared sorrow. It felt like a string on an instrument being plucked, a vibration that connected her own empty arms to the palpable absence in this small, quiet room. Her heart ached, not just for herself anymore, but for this silent man and his motherless children, for the story this tiny shawl told. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her own grief rising to meet the one that lived within these walls. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of deep violet and bruised orange, a profound stillness fell over the ranch. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Maribel stood in the doorway of the house, watching. Rowan emerged from the barn, his large frame silhouetted against the dying light. In his arms, he carried a sleeping Ren Li, her small head nestled into the curve of his neck, her breathing soft and even. He moved with a surprising grace, his rough hands infinitely gentle as he carried his youngest child. He stopped by a small, sturdy crib that had been set up just inside the wide barn doors, where the cool night air could circulate, with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior. He laid her down, his large, calloused hand, a hand that could break a horse or split a log, lingered for a moment, smoothing the thin blanket over her small body. The gesture was as light and quiet as the evening breeze, a moment of pure, unguarded love in the vast, lonely twilight. The first dawn at the Pike Ranch was colder than Maribel had anticipated. She woke before the light, a habit ingrained by years of moving, of never allowing herself to settle too deeply into sleep. The small cot in the alcove was surprisingly comfortable, but the air in the house was still and heavy with the chill of the high plains night. She dressed quietly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her dress, her breath pluming in the dimness. She expected to find the main room dark, the stove a cold block of iron. She expected to be the one to light the fire, to boil the water, to begin the day's labor alone. Instead, as she stepped into the kitchen area, she saw it, sitting on the stone hearth, insulated from the cold floor by a folded piece of wool sacking, was a single brown bottle. She touched it. It was warm. Not hot, but deeply, pleasantly warm. It was milk. She looked around. The house was silent. Rowan's door was closed. The children were still sleeping soundly. Bo in a small trundle and the lark in a cot near his. There was no note, no indication of who had left it. It was simply there. An anonymous, functional act of provision. It was, Maribel thought, a tangible kindness. It was not a welcome, which would have felt false and effusive. It was not a gift, which would imply an obligation. It was simply a recognition that she was here, that she was cold, and that she might be hungry. It was the most practical, and therefore the most profound, gesture of inclusion she had received in years. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, a private acknowledgement of this silent man's quiet ways. She drank the milk slowly, the warmth spreading through her chest, fortifying her against the morning and the task ahead. The first meal they shared as a group was a trial of silence. Rowan had moved Renly's crib into the main room, and the toddler was babbling happily to her spool doll, her sounds the only relief in the thick quiet. Rowan sat at the head of the table, eating a bowl of oatmeal with a methodical focus, his presence a heavy weight in the room. Tanner sat to his right, a miniature echo of his father, his movements careful, his eyes fixed on his bowl. Lark sat opposite, her small shoulders hunched, stirring her oatmeal into a gray, unappetizing paste, her wheat-colored hair falling forward to hide her face. Bo was the only one who seemed to vibrate with suppressed energy, his bare feet kicking a rhythmic, muffled drumbeat against the leg of the table until a single, sharp glance from Rowan stilled him. Maribel, sitting at the far end, felt like a foreign object, a stone dropped into a still pond. The silence was not peaceful. It was defensive. It was the high walls of a fortress built by 4 children and 1 man against the world. She cleared her throat, and 4 pairs of eyes, 5, if she counted Rowan's brief. Upward flicker snapped to her. "The air is clear this morning," she offered, her voice sounding unnaturally loud. "It smells like rain, even without the clouds." Tanner grunted, a sound he had clearly learned from his father. Lark sank lower in her chair. Bo, seizing the moment of distraction, slid from the bench. "Bo, sit," Rowan said, his voice a low rumble, not needing to be loud to be obeyed. Bo froze. Maribel tried again, directing her words to the eldest, hoping to find an ally. "Tanner, I saw you outside. You were working on that bridle by the trough. You have a very steady hand with the leather awl." Tanner flushed a deep, painful red. He looked at his plate, then at his father, as if he'd been accused of a crime. He mumbled something incoherent, snatched a piece of cornbread, and bolted from the table, disappearing out the back door. That was the signal. Like a covey of quail bursting from the brush, the others followed. Lark was a silent blur, and Bo scrambled after his older siblings, his escape punctuated by a triumphant giggle. In seconds, the table was empty, save for Rowan and Maribel, and the echoing silence they left behind. Maribel's hands clenched in her lap. She had failed. She had pushed too hard, spoken too loud, breached the walls without permission. These were not students. They were wild, wounded things. Rowan finished his oatmeal. He stood, his large frame blocking the light from the door. "They're not used to talk," he said simply, as if explaining the weather. He picked up his hat. "They'll be by the creek." And then he, too, was gone. Maribel was left alone with the dirty bowls and the profound sense of her own inadequacy. She had promised this man she knew how to be a mother, and at the first test, she had sent them fleeing. She knew, with a deep certainty, that chasing them would be the worst thing she could do. You could not chase a frightened animal. You had to let it come to you. She cleaned the kitchen, her movements slow and deliberate. She found a rhythm in the work, the simple, honest labor of scrubbing the wooden bowls and wiping the table. When the house was in order, she took her slate, but then thought better of it. A slate was a tool of lessons, of authority. She didn't need authority. She needed curiosity. She went outside. The sun was higher now, baking the yard into a hard, cracked pan. The children were where Rowan said they'd be, a safe distance away, near the line of cottonwoods by the creek. They were playing some complicated game with sticks and stones, but she could feel their eyes on her, watching her every move. She did not walk toward them. Instead, she found a patch of smooth, packed earth near the side of the porch, a place where the sun was warm, but not hot. She sat, pulling her knees up and smoothing her skirts, making herself small. Then, She picked up a fallen twig. She began to draw in the dust. She didn't draw letters. She drew pictures. She drew a large, looping spiral. "A snail in his shell," she murmured, just loud enough for her own ears. Then, next to it, she drew a tall, spiky shape, a pine tree on a hill. She continued her game, lost in her own world, or so she made it seem. She could feel the magnetic pull of their curiosity. The game by the creek faltered. She heard a twig snap. She didn't look up. Bo, predictably, was the first to break. His 5-year-old inquisitiveness was stronger than his fear. He ambled over, his footsteps shuffling in the dust, and stopped a few feet away. He watched as she drew a circle with 2 long ears. "Rabbit," he stated, his voice a little hoarse. Maribel smiled, still looking at the dirt. "That's right, a rabbit." She drew a small, fluffy tail. Then, she drew a long, sinuous curve. "And what's this?" "Snake," Bo whispered, taking another step closer. "An S for snake," she said, tracing the shape again, making it bold. "See, it slithers, just like him." She drew a capital C next. "And this C is a cat's tail, all curled up for a nap." Lark had drifted closer now, her small, pale face a mask of wary interest. Even Tanner was hovering at the edge of the yard, pretending to inspect a fence post, but his attention was fixed on her. This became their routine. For 2 days, she held her silent lesson in the dust. She never called them. She never forced them. She simply offered a puzzle, a game. They learned the alphabet as a collection of pictures, of shapes that existed in their world. A was the peak of the mountain. M was 2 mountains side by side. O was the sun. On the 3rd day, she brought a handful of small, smooth pebbles from the creek bed. Bo, now her shadow, sat down beside her without hesitation. "Let's build a word," she said. She pointed to the largest, oldest cottonwood that dominated the ranch line. "What is that?" "Tree," Bo said. "Tree," she repeated, sounding it out. "T-R-E." She laid out a T with the pebbles. "Tanner, what sound is that?" The older boy startled, surprised to be included. He shrugged, but his eyes were smart. "T," he said. "Good. T for Tanner." She laid out an R. "Lark, this one." Lark whispered, "Like Rowan." Maribel nodded, her heart swelling. "And E." She laid out the E. "T-R-E-E, tree." Bo's eyes went wide. He stared at the pebbles, then at the tree, as if he'd just witnessed a miracle. The connection had been made. The marks in the dirt, the pebbles on the ground, were not just a game. They were the thing itself. They were power. His small, dusty hand, the fingernails chipped and black with grime, shot out. He scattered her pebbles. "My turn." His tongue stuck out of the corner of his mouth in concentration. He painstakingly formed a T, then an R. He paused, looking to her for confirmation. She nodded. He laid out one E, and then a second one. He sat back on his heels, his chest puffed with pride. "Tree!" he shouted, his voice cracking with the force of it. He pointed at his work, then at the cottonwood, then back at his word. "Tree." He looked up at Maribel, and the light in his eyes was blinding. It was the sharp, brilliant clarity of a spring bubbling up from the driest ground. It was the pure, unadulterated joy of discovery, of understanding. In that moment, he was not a motherless, wary child. He was a scholar, a creator. He had captured the world with 4 pebbles. During this, Rowan had passed by twice, once on his way to the corral, once on his way back, carrying a heavy saddle. He was a man who moved with purpose, who never wasted emotion, but he had slowed his step. He had watched the children gathered around her. He had seen Bo's fierce concentration, had heard his triumphant shout. As Bo scrambled to find more pebbles, eager to build another word. Maribel looked up. Rowan had paused at the porch steps. He was watching her, his face unreadable in the shadow of his hat's brim. She met his gaze, her heart suddenly uncertain. Had she overstepped? Was this too much, too soon? He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The wind whispered between them, carrying the smell of dust and the faint scent of the creek. Then he gave a single, short, downward dip of his chin. A nod. It was nothing more than that. It was not a smile. It was not praise. It was the acknowledgement of a man who did not know how to praise, a man who dealt in the currency of work done and results seen. The nod said, "This is good. This is right. Continue." A quiet warmth spread through her, settling deep in her chest. It was enough. That night, the house felt different. A change had taken place, a small shift in the tectonic plates of their family. But the night brought its own reminders. Long after the older children were asleep, a small, whimpering cry came from Renly's crib. It wasn't a cry of hunger or pain, but the distressed, fussy sound of a child caught in a bad dream. Maribel rose, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She saw Rowan in his usual spot, asleep in the straight-backed chair by the stove, his boots still on, his head slumped against his chest. He was exhausted, worn down to the bone by the weight of his responsibilities. He hadn't even heard the cry. She went to the crib. Renly was twisting in her blankets, her small fists clenched. Maribel gently lifted the child. Renly was warm and smelled of soap and sweet milk. She settled against Maribel's shoulder, her sobs hiccuping as she clung to the warmth. Maribel walked the floor with her, her steps a slow, rocking rhythm. She began to hum, almost unconsciously. It wasn't a Western ballad or a camp meeting hymn. It was a soft, gentle melody from a different life, a tune her own mother used to sing to her in a green, rainy world thousands of miles away. It was a song of willow trees and quiet harbors, a lullaby from the east. The melancholic, soothing notes filled the small room. Renly's body relaxed, her breathing deepened, and her tiny hand unclenched, her fingers curling around a lock of Maribel's hair. After laying the sleeping toddler back in her crib, Maribel didn't return to her own cot immediately. The moment with Renly had stirred the quiet, settled grief within her. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled her worn satchel into her lap. From it, she took the small, cloth-wrapped box. She opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object, a pale blue silk ribbon, the edges frayed, but the color still true. Stitched into it with painstaking, tiny letters was a name, Elodie. Her fingers traced the embroidery. A ritual she had performed 1,000 times. She could still feel the fine, downy hair it used to tie back. The familiar ache blossomed in her chest, a hollow space that would never be filled. But the tears did not come. They rarely did anymore. Her grief was no longer a storm that threatened to drown her. It was the climate she lived in. A quiet, steady, gentle ache that was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. Holding Renly hadn't been painful. It hadn't replaced what she had lost. It had simply reminded her that her hands still knew how to comfort, that her arms had not forgotten their purpose. She closed the box. The small click, a renewal of her promise to remember, and put it away. A few evenings later, the children were asleep, and a rare quiet had fallen over the house. The single lamp on the table cast a pool of warm, yellow light, leaving the corners of the room in deep shadow. Maribel was reviewing a tattered copy of a primer, planning the next day's lessons. She heard a sound, a low, frustrated sigh from the porch. She looked up. Rowan was sitting in the open doorway, angled so he could catch the last of the ambient light. He was hunched over something small in his lap. It was one of Beau's shirts, a blue and white gingham check, the one he had ripped on the barbed wire fence that afternoon. Rowan was trying to mend it. She watched him, unseen, his large, calloused hands. So powerful and certain when handling a rope or an axe, were hopelessly clumsy with a tiny needle and thread. He squinted, trying to thread the needle for what seemed like the third time. The stitches he had already managed to make were large, crooked, and pulled the fabric into a tight, ugly pucker. He was a mountain trying to thread a needle. He huffed again, his frustration palpable. Maribel felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy. He was trying to do her work, a mother's work, and he was failing. She knew better than to offer to take it from him. That would be an insult to his effort, a dismissal of his care. She stood, pretending to stretch, and walked to the water bucket near the door to get a drink. She paused, as if just noticing his task. She looked at the small, crumpled garment in his massive hands. "That blue gingham," she said softly, her voice just a quiet murmur in the night air. "It suits him. It brings out the blue in his eyes." Rowan stilled. His fumbling ceased. He stopped fighting the needle and simply looked down at the shirt. His thumb, rough as bark, gently stroked the checked fabric, smoothing the wrinkles his own stitches had made. A flicker of some distant memory passed over his face, a softening of his hard-set jaw. "He favors this one," Rowan said, his voice so low she almost didn't catch it. The words hung in the silence between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. "He favors this one." It was a simple statement, but she heard what he wasn't saying. His mother made it. This is one of the last things he has of her. He remembers. Rowan wasn't just mending a tear in a shirt. He was trying, in his own clumsy, desperate way, to patch a hole in his son's life, to hold on to a memory that was fading with every season. His crooked, angry stitches were an act of profound, protective love. Maribel simply nodded, a deep understanding passing between them. She took her dipper of water and returned to her side of the room, leaving him to his sacred, difficult work. As the days turned into a week, the house itself began to change. It was no longer just a shell, a place to shelter from the wind and sun. Maribel's presence filled the corners that had been empty for so long, the sound of her quiet humming the Eastern lullaby for Renly. A simple folk tune as she swept the floor became a new, soft texture in the air. The house, which had only known the sound of heavy boots, children's shouts, and the mournful wind, now seemed to breathe differently. It was softer, fuller. The children, too, were finding a new rhythm. They were still satellites orbiting the massive, silent gravity of their father. They still measured their safety by the sound of his footsteps on the porch, the heavy, reassuring thud that meant he was home, that the world was in its proper place. But their orbit had widened. Now, they also listened for the light scrape of her stick in the dust, the soft shush of her broom, and the quiet, steady murmur of her voice as she read to them in the evenings. The ranch was finding a new heartbeat, one that was slower, steadier, and infinitely more complex. Maribel learned to read the Pike children not by their words, which were few, but by their hands. Lark, the sensitive one, twisted the ends of her fine, wheat-colored braids whenever a question troubled her, the tight coils a barometer of her internal anxiety. Beau's hands were a constant blur of motion, grabbing, pointing, patting the dogs, a physical extension of his boundless, 5-year-old curiosity. And Tanner, the quiet sentinel, kept his hands to himself. He stood at the edge of every conversation, every game, his posture a study in watchful stillness. His hands would rest on the top rail of the corral fence or be tucked into his pockets, but his eyes missed nothing. Maribel knew he was full of unspoken thoughts, a reservoir of observations waiting for the right moment, the right season, to be spoken aloud. He was waiting for a sign that it was safe. To give them that sign, Maribel decided they needed more than lessons in the dust. They needed a space that was wholly theirs. She commandeered a section of the wide, covered porch that faced the morning sun. She took 2 sturdy wooden barrels, ones that had once held salted fish, and set them a few feet apart. Across them, she laid the large, smooth piece of slate she had carried in her satchel, creating a makeshift desk and blackboard. This was their alphabet corner. But she knew a school was more than a slate. Using the precious nubs of chalk she possessed, she didn't draw letters first. She drew a delicate vine that snaked up one side of the slate and a spray of cheerful, bell-shaped flowers on the other. It was an invitation, not a command. The children understood immediately. The next morning, a small, wilting Indian paintbrush was tucked into a crack in one of the barrels. The day after, a bright yellow sunflower, its head heavy with seeds, was propped against the slate. They took turns, a silent ritual, decorating their space with the wild, resilient beauty of the plains. The alphabet corner became a living thing, a small garden of knowledge that they all tended together. The routines that began to form were the threads from which the fabric of a new family was woven. Lunch had always been a solitary affair. Rowan would take his plate of cornbread and beans and eat on the top porch step, his back to the house, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if guarding against some unseen threat. The children would scatter with their food, eating in the barn or by the creek, like a litter of feral kittens. On the 5th day of her stay, Maribel made a decision. She baked a fresh batch of cornbread, the edges a little darker than intended, the smell of it warm and comforting in the small house, instead of letting them scatter. She set the long wooden table inside, 4 tin plates for the children, 1 for herself, and 1 at the head of the table. When Rowan came in from the fields, dusty and tired, he reached for a plate as usual, intending to retreat to his post on the porch. "Mr. Pike," Maribel said, her voice gentle but firm, "the table is set. There's a place for you." He stopped, his hand hovering over the bread. He looked from her to the table, then back again. His hesitation was a physical thing, a visible struggle between ingrained habit and this new, unexpected invitation. To sit at that table was to admit something had changed, to acknowledge her presence not as a temporary hired hand, but as a part of the household. It was a line he had not yet crossed. The silence stretched, filled only by the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. Bo watched him, his eyes wide, a crumb of cornbread stuck to his cheek. Finally, with a slow, deliberate movement, Rowan walked to the table. He pulled out the chair at its head and sat. The wood groaned under his weight. He did not speak, but he stayed. He ate his meal surrounded by the quiet chewing and occasional whispers of his children. The fortress had lowered its gate. Just for a moment, the most sacred ritual became the one that ended the day. After the supper dishes were cleared, Maribel would light the single oil lamp, its golden glow pushing back the vast, empty darkness of the prairie night. She had traded one of her medicinal salves in Sagebrush Hollow for a tattered, second-hand book of fables. Each night, they would gather around the table for the reading. Each child found their role. Tanner, as the eldest, was given the honor of reading aloud. His voice, still boyish but deepening, would sound out the words carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. He stumbled often, but his pride in being the narrator was evident. Lark, perched beside him, became the gentle critic, pronounced thick in night. "Tanner," she would whisper, her finger pointing to the word, her anxiety channeled into a need for precision. Bo, too young to follow the story for long, was given the task of counting the rungs on the ladder that led to the small sleeping loft, his whispered numbers a rhythmic counterpoint to Tanner's reading, and little Renly, sitting in Maribel's lap, would trace the patterns on the faded calico curtain, counting the tiny, printed stars, her soft babbling a part of the evening's music. It was a nightly symphony of small efforts, a family learning to make a shared sound. Rowan began to change. Too, the shift was subtle, like a change in the wind. He was a man accustomed to making every decision alone, from when to plant to how to set a broken bone on a calf. But one evening, as Maribel was tucking the blankets around Renly in her crib, he spoke from the shadows near the stove. "That corner gets a draft," he said, his voice a low rumble. "By the stove is warmer. We should move the crib." It was not a command, but a suggestion seeking her agreement. Maribel turned. Surprised. "Yeah," she said, "that's a good idea. She'll sleep better there." Another time, as he watched her guide Beau's hand in forming a perfect number 3 on the slate, he asked, "Numbers first, or should they know all their letters before they start with sums?" The questions were short, practical, but to Maribel, they were seismic. He was asking for her opinion. He was sharing the burden. He was, in his own taciturn way, building a partnership. The space between them, once a vast, silent canyon, was now being crossed by these small, sturdy bridges of trust. Her own role had grown far beyond that of a teacher. She became the mender, the healer, the comber of hair. Her touch was always measured, respectful of the children's ingrained wariness. A quick, efficient cleaning of a scraped knee for Beau. Her fingers gentle but businesslike as she applied a comfrey salve. A brief, light touch on Lark's shoulder to praise a perfectly spelled word. She would patiently unpick the snarls from the girl's fine hair in the mornings. Her movements slow and rhythmic, a silent lesson in gentle care. These small, repeated acts of physical comfort were accumulating, building a new definition of home in the children's minds. Home was the smell of baking bread. Home was the sound of a story read aloud. Home was a cool hand on a feverish forehead. She taught them manners not through scolding, but through play. One afternoon, they acted out a visit to a general store. Tanner was the storekeeper, Maribel was a customer, and Beau and Lark were her children. "What do you say when Mr. Tanner gives you the candy?" she prompted Beau. He giggled, then puffed out his chest and said in a deep voice, "Thank you, Sir Lark." In turn, practiced a polite, "Excuse me, I seem to have dropped my parcel." The game dissolved into gales of laughter that echoed across the yard. A sound so rich and full it seemed to startle the birds in the cottonwoods. On a trip to the market in Sagebrush Hollow to replenish their supply of flour and salt, Maribel took her small stock of remedies. She traded a jar of her burn ointment to May Whitlow, the kind, round-faced owner of the mercantile, for 2 worn but serviceable school books. As May wrapped the books in brown paper, she leaned in conspiratorially. "You hear the talk, dear," she whispered, her eyes wide. "The railroad. They say the Red Meridian Line is planning a route straight through this territory." Maribel felt a prickle of unease. "I hadn't heard." "Oh, yes," May continued, gesturing with her head toward the public notice board outside. "Their man is coming. A real sharp-dressed fella, they say, name of Silas Duval. Going to be surveying the whole Dry Willow Basin." Maribel's gaze followed May's to the board. Pinned amongst notices for a lost cow and an upcoming church social was a crisp, professionally printed flyer. The words Red Meridian Railroad were in a bold, authoritative typeface. It announced that a company agent, Mr. Silas Duval, would be conducting a preliminary land survey in the coming weeks. The name Dry Willow Basin seemed to jump off the page. That was their valley. That was the Pike Ranch. When she returned, the books were a cause for celebration. But later that evening, as the children slept, she showed the notice to Rowan. He scanned it, his expression unconcerned, almost dismissive. He crumpled the flyer in his large hand and tossed it into the firebox of the stove. "It's nothing," he said, his voice full of the unshakable certainty of a man who only trusted the ground beneath his feet. "They're just talk. Railroad needs flat ground, easy water. They'll go south, through the flats. They always do." But Maribel saw something else. As Rowan spoke, she glanced at Tanner, who was sitting in the shadows, mending a strap on his boot. The boy's head was down, but she saw his hands still. She saw the tension in his young shoulders, and when he finally looked up, his eyes met hers for a brief, fleeting moment. In them, she saw a flicker of a deep, familiar worry. He had seen something, He remembered something. She recalled Rowan saying the children had been found, not born, on this land. Perhaps Tanner's memory held more than his father knew. He remembered. Maribel was certain. The glint of sun on a brass transit. The strange, methodical movements of men who did not belong, measuring the land by the creek as if it were already theirs. The next afternoon, a stillness settled over the ranch. The air was warm and heavy, holding the promise of a distant rain. To escape the heat inside, Maribel took the children to the shade by the horse trough. She had a stack of old newspapers and circulars she'd gotten from May, with careful, precise folds. She showed them how to create something from nothing. She folded the paper into a small boat. Beau's eyes lit up. Soon, all four of them were folding, their small hands working alongside hers, creating a tiny fleet. Tanner's boat was sharp and perfect. Lark's was a little crooked, but she had drawn a flower on its sail. Beau's was a crumpled mess, but he loved it fiercely. They launched their small armada in the long, cool water of the trough. The paper boats bobbed and drifted, their fragile hulls catching the slight breeze. They floated on the dark water, their white paper reflecting the endless, brilliant blue of the sky above. It was a moment of perfect, crystalline peace, but watching the small, vulnerable fleet drift, Maribel felt a familiar chill. Their new life, this fragile family they were building with rituals and small kindnesses, felt just like one of those paper boats, a small, hopeful thing, set afloat on dark water, under a vast and unpredictable sky. The peace shattered with the sound of a whip cracking, sharp and unnatural against the drowsy afternoon air. Then another, closer this time. It wasn't a whip. It was the sharp, percussive pop of firecrackers, a sound that had no place in the quiet rhythm of the plains. The first sign of trouble was a low rumble that vibrated through the soles of Maribel's shoes. It grew with terrifying speed, a sound of rolling thunder on a cloudless day. From the north pasture, a wave of brown and white crested the rise, the small herd of cattle, their eyes wide with blind panic, their horns tossing, were in a full, uncontrolled stampede. A cloud of yellow dust billowed up behind them, a roiling, suffocating storm that swallowed the sky. They were headed directly for the ranch yard, for the flimsy barrier of the northern fence. The paper boats in the water trough were forgotten. The world had compressed into a single, roaring moment of terror. Inside, Rowan's voice was a raw, commanding bellow that cut through the din. He was already moving, his body a blur of purpose. "Tanner, the main corral gate, get it wide now." It was a dangerous, almost impossible task. The 11-year-old boy would have to run directly into the path of the oncoming herd to swing the heavy wooden gate open, to try and channel the stampede away from the house and barn. For a heartbeat. Tanner froze, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the terrifying wave of horns and hooves. Then he looked at his father, saw the absolute command in his eyes, and he ran. Maribel's mind worked with a preternatural calm, a clarity born of crisis. She scooped a crying Renly from the ground, the toddler's small body trembling violently. "Lark!" she shouted, her voice sharp and clear. "Take Beau's hand. The root cellar, go now. Don't look back." Lark's face was a mask of fear, her braids twisting in her white-knuckled grip. But at Maribel's command, a flicker of resolve ignited in her eyes. She grabbed her younger brother's hand, his face a bewildered crumple of confusion, and pulled him hard toward the heavy, slanted doors of the cellar set into the earth behind the house. "Come on, Beau," she sobbed, dragging him with a strength she didn't know she possessed. As Maribel herded them toward safety, a movement at the edge of the chaos caught her eye. It was a rider, a dark figure on a dark horse, galloping along the fence line, a stark silhouette against the dust cloud. The rider wore a long, black duster and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring his face. This was no rancher trying to help. This was the source of the chaos. As he drew parallel with the large, tinder-dry stack of hay next to the barn, His arm swung up and over his head. A flaming object, a torch made of a pitch-soaked rags, arced through the air. It landed in the hay with a soft thump. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, with a hungry, explosive whoosh, the hay ignited. Flames erupted, licking up the side of the barn like a serpent's tongue. Impossibly fast, impossibly bright. Rowan had seen it too, with a roar of pure, primal fury. He abandoned the stampede and charged the rider. He moved with the speed and power of a grizzly, covering the ground in a few giant strides. He launched himself from the ground, tackling the man clean off his horse. They crashed to the earth in a tangle of limbs and flying dust. The horse shied, screaming, and galloped away. Rowan was on his feet first, hauling the dazed man up by the front of his shirt. The rider's hat had flown off, and his hood had fallen back. Maribel saw his face, a doughy, slack-jawed man with terrified eyes. He was one of the men she had seen loitering outside the tax office in Sagebrush Hollow, a known associate of the county assessor, Horace Milligan. "It was an accident," the man stammered, his voice a pathetic whine. Spittle flew from his lips. "The herd got spooked. The torch. It was an accident." Rowan's face was a terrible mask of rage. He drew back his fist, but just as he was about to strike, the man squirmed free, kicking out wildly. He scrambled to his feet and fled on foot, stumbling and panicked, disappearing into the dust and chaos. As he ran, a folded piece of paper fell from his duster pocket, landing unnoticed in the trampled dirt. The fire was now a raging inferno, the flames climbing the barn wall, the heat so intense it was painful to breathe. The stampeding cattle, turned by Tanner's heroic effort at the gate, thundered past the yard and into the open rangeland beyond. But the immediate threat was now the fire. "Buckets!" Rowan yelled, grabbing two from the trough. Maribel, having shoved Lark and Bo into the relative safety of the cellar, slammed the heavy doors shut and ran to help. What happened next was a blur of frantic, coordinated action. There was no time for plans or discussion. They simply moved, a single unit fighting for their survival. Rowan and Maribel soaked heavy wool blankets in the trough, using them to beat at the base of the flames, trying to smother the fire before it could consume the whole structure. The smoke was thick and acrid, burning their lungs, stinging their eyes. Tanner, his face streaked with soot and tears, worked the handle of the hand pump with a desperate, furious energy, filling bucket after bucket. Lark, her fear now replaced by a grim determination, emerged from the cellar, pulling a bewildered Bo behind her. They formed a chain. Tanner filled. Lark grabbed the heavy bucket and hauled it halfway, and Bo, his small face set in a serious scowl, dragged it the rest of the way to where Maribel and Rowan were fighting the blaze. They worked with a rhythm born not of practice, but of necessity and a deep, unspoken trust. They were a family, forged in this trial by fire. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to win. The flames that had licked up the barn wall receded, leaving behind a gaping, blackened wound of charred timbers. The hay pile was a smoldering, hissing ruin, exhausted, choking, and covered in soot. They finally collapsed in the yard as the last of the embers died. The barn was saved, but their sanctuary had been violated. That evening, Sheriff Pratt arrived. He was a portly man with a lazy mustache and eyes that seemed perpetually half-closed. He rode into the yard, his horse picking its way carefully around the debris. He dismounted, looked at the scorched barn, at the trampled fence, and at the exhausted, dirty family. "Heard you had some trouble out here. Pike," he said, his voice devoid of any real concern. "It was no trouble. Sheriff, it was an attack," Rowan said, his voice flat and hard. "A man on a dark horse. He stampeded my herd and set fire to my barn. One of Milligan's men." The sheriff took out a small, dog-eared notebook and a pencil stub. He made a few lazy marks. "You get a good look at him?" "I had my hands on him," Rowan snarled. "Anyone else see him?" Pratt asked, his gaze flicking to Maribel and the children. "We all saw him," Maribel said, her voice trembling with barely suppressed anger. Pratt sighed, a long, weary sound, as if this were all a great inconvenience. "Well, that's your word against his, I suppose, and his horse is long gone. Man's probably halfway to the territory line by now." He closed his notebook. "No real proof of anything. Could have been a drifter. Could have been an accident. Like you said, a stray spark from a pipe. Maybe." "He threw a torch," Tanner said, his voice small but clear. "I saw him throw it." The sheriff just looked at the boy and shook his head slowly. "Lot of dust, son. Easy to get confused in a panic." He swung himself back onto his horse. "I'll file a report, but I wouldn't expect much to come of it." He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving them alone in the gathering dusk with the smell of wet ash and injustice. Later, inside the house, the lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of smoke that clung to their clothes and hair. Maribel remembered the paper the man had dropped. She retrieved it from the yard, carefully unfolding the dusty, wrinkled document on the kitchen table. It was a tax delinquency notice from the county, but it was wrong. The official seal in the corner was slightly different, the impression less sharp than others she had seen, and the number written on it was absurd. A figure so high it would mean forfeiting the entire ranch 10 times over. It was a fabrication, a clumsy but menacing one. "This is what he was carrying," she said, her voice a low murmur. Rowan came to stand behind her, looking over her shoulder. He went very still. "They're trying to scare us off," Maribel said. "But why go to these lengths? Why not just make a legal claim?" Rowan was silent for a long time. He walked over to the stove and stared into the cold firebox. His broad shoulders slumped with a weariness that went far beyond the physical exhaustion of the day. "Because a legal claim," he said, his back still to her, "might be all they need." He turned to face her, and in the lamplight, she saw the raw fear in his eyes. It was a fear he had hidden from the children, from the sheriff, from the world, but he couldn't hide it from her. "This ranch, the deed is in my name. It's solid," he began, his voice rough. "But the children, that's a different story. Maribel." He confessed it all then, the words coming out in a torrent, as if a dam had finally broken. The children were not his by birth. She knew that much, but she hadn't known how precarious his claim to them was. There were no official adoption papers from a territorial court. There were no legal documents. Tanner's mother had died in a blizzard, pressing her son into Rowan's arms with her last breath. Lark and Beau's parents had passed from cholera in a wagon train, leaving a hastily scrawled note giving their children over to the first kind soul they found. Renly had been left on the church steps in Sagebrush Hollow, and the pastor, knowing Rowan had a good heart and a strong back, had brought her to him. "All I have are promises," Rowan said, his voice cracking. "Promises to the dying, a few lines of ink on scraps of paper, nothing a real judge, a man like Milligan, would ever recognize. If they challenge my guardianship, if they say I'm an unfit parent living on delinquent land, they can take them from me. Maribel, they can take my children." The full, monstrous weight of the day's events crashed down on her. The stampede, the fire. They weren't just about the land. They were a brutal, calculated attack on the very foundation of this family. They were creating the evidence they needed to declare him unfit. Maribel's mind raced, pushing past the fear, searching for a weapon, for a plan. Promises to the dying might not be enough, but facts were, history was. "The midwife," she said, the words coming out in a sudden rush of inspiration. "When you told me about them, you mentioned a midwife in Half Moon Ford, Alma Thistle. She delivered Lark and Beau, didn't she?" Rowan looked up, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "Yes, old Alma. She was there." "Midwives keep records," Maribel pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "A ledger, with names, dates, circumstances. It's not a court document, but it's a record. It's a testament. It would show that their parents were here, that they passed, and that the children were left in your care. It would prove they were abandoned, not stolen. It would be a start. It would be something real." A fragile sliver of hope cut through the despair in the room. It was a long shot, a desperate chance, but it was more than they had a moment ago. "I'll go at first light," Maribel said, her decision absolute. "I'll find her. I'll find that book." Rowan just nodded, his throat too tight for words. He looked at his sleeping children, his heart an open wound. Maribel stood and walked to the window, looking out into the blackness. The frame of the window was scorched, the wood blackened and blistered. Through that dark, wounded frame, she saw it, far out on the horizon, moving slowly along the ridge that defined the dry willow basin, was a pair of faint, yellow lights. It was a carriage, a fine one, moving with a steady, unhurried pace in the dead of night. It could only be one person. Silas Duval, the man from the railroad. He wasn't celebrating his victory. He was surveying his new territory, calmly, quietly, from a safe distance. He was out there in the darkness, under the cold, unblinking stars, silently measuring the distance to his profits, a distance he had tried to shorten today with fire and fear. Maribel's journey to Half Moon Ford was over before it began. The day after the fire, the world turned. The sky, which had been a clear, high blue, took on the sick greenish-yellow tint of a fresh bruise. The wind did not rise, it fell, creating a dead, heavy silence that was more terrifying than any gale. And then, from the north, the storm hit. It came not as a gentle curtain of snow, but as a horizontal blast of ice and wind. It was a premature, unnatural blizzard, a physical assault on the already wounded land. The wind didn't whistle, it shrieked, a high, thin sound like a steel saw biting into frozen timber. Within an hour, the world was gone, reduced to a howling white void. The temperature plummeted with sickening speed. The snow, driven by the wind, didn't settle. It blasted against the house, piling in massive drifts, sealing them inside. A terrible splintering crash echoed from the yard as the roof of the old, fire-damaged tool shed finally gave way under the impossible weight of the snow. They were trapped. The trip to Half Moon Ford, their one small hope, was now an impossibility. They were an island in a roaring ocean of white. It was in this suffocating isolation that the true crisis began. That evening, Lark coughed. It was not a child's simple cough. It was a dry, hacking sound that rattled in her small chest, a sound that seemed to come from too deep. By morning, she was burning. Her skin was a frightening dry parchment, her cheeks too small, bright flags of color. Her eyes, usually so wary and sensitive, were glassy and unfocused. She was trapped in the grip of a violent fever. Maribel's hands shook as she mixed a decoction of willow bark and yarrow, remedies she had in her satchel. But this time, her hands trembled not from the profound chill that had invaded the house, but from a cold, sharp blade of fear. She knew this kind of fever. It was the kind that came on fast, that burned too hot, that had taken her own Elodie. The fire, the terror, the subsequent drenching, and the bone-deep chill had broken through the child's delicate defenses. Her herbs, her knowledge, all of it felt woefully inadequate against this. Rowan stood by the small cot, his large frame a useless mountain of strength. He watched Maribel bathe Lark's forehead with a damp cloth, his face a mask of iron-hard control. But his eyes were raw with a helplessness that tore at Maribel's heart. "The herbs are not working," Maribel stated, her voice a low whisper. "She is burning up. Rowan, we need something stronger." Rowan looked from the sick child to the window, which was now a solid, opaque wall of white. The wind screamed, mocking them. His decision. when it came, was as sharp and sudden as the storm itself. "I'm going to Redwater Creek," he said, his voice a low rumble. Maribel's head snapped up. "What? You can't. That's 10 miles. Through this? You'll never make it. You'll die before you clear the basin." "Elder Two Branches lives at the creek," Rowan said, pulling his heaviest wool coat from its peg. "The Absoluk know this fever. They have a medicine for it. A leaf." "No, Rowan, it's madness. We will wait. The storm has to break." "The fever won't wait," he said, his voice flat and final. He began checking the loads in his rifle, his movements economical and precise. "I'm going with you," a small, firm voice said. They both turned. Tanner stood in the doorway of the sleeping area, fully dressed, his own thin coat in his hand. He was pale, but his jaw was set with a miniature version of his father's stubbornness. "No," Rowan said, not even looking at him. "You stay here. You keep the fire. You're the man of the house." "I am going with you," Tanner repeated, his voice shaking but gaining strength. "Two men are better than one. What if the horse goes down? What if you fall? Who will get the medicine back?" He took a steadying breath and played his final card. "I open the gate. Pa, I can do this." Rowan stopped his preparations. He looked at his son. He looked at the boy who had stood his ground against a stampede, who had worked the pump handle until his hands bled. He saw not a child, but a partner. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Get the heavy rope from the barn." Tanner didn't hesitate. He was gone and back in a minute. The rope coiled over his shoulder, a grim pride in his eyes. Maribel wanted to scream, to forbid it, to chain them both to the stove. But she looked at Lark, who had begun to murmur in her delirium. And she knew this was the only chance they had. She helped Rowan bind their boots with strips of canvas to give them purchase, her hands working quickly, her mind numb. She packed a small packet of dried beef and cornbread, pressing it into Rowan's coat pocket. "Godspeed, Rowan," she whispered, her hand lingering on his arm for just a second. He looked at her, his eyes dark with the enormity of the risk. "Keep the fire hot. Maribel, keep her fighting." He and Tanner bound the rope around their waists, tying themselves together. They plunged out the door, two figures instantly consumed by the white, howling chaos. The door slammed shut, and the sound of the wind was the only sound left, a hungry, terrible wail. The journey was a descent into a frozen hell. The world was reduced to a space of 10 feet in every direction. The snow was waist-deep in the drifts, a thick, heavy powder that fought them for every step. Rowan led, breaking the trail, his body a human snowplow, with Tanner stumbling in his wake, clinging to the rope that was their only lifeline. The horse, a sturdy Mustang named Old Jeb, lowered its head and pushed, its breath freezing in great crystalline clouds. The wind was a living thing, a malevolent entity that tried to rip the breath from their lungs and freeze the blood in their veins. Ice crusted in Rowan's beard and matted in Tanner's eyelashes, nearly blinding him. The true test came at Half Moon Ford. The creek was a monster, a churning slurry of gray water and massive, jagged plates of ice. But the storm had frozen the surface in a treacherous, uneven sheet. It was not solid enough to hold their full weight, but too thick to break through. "We go fast," Rowan yelled over the roar of the wind. "Don't stop, no matter what." He urged Jeb onto the ice. The horse, sensing the danger, shied, its ears flat. Rowan kicked, and the horse lunged forward. They were halfway across when the ice groaned, a terrible, deep sound like the earth itself splitting open. Jeb's hind leg broke through. The horse screamed, a sound of pure terror, and thrashed, threatening to pull them all into the freezing water. The violent lurch snapped the left rein, the frozen leather parting with a sound like a pistol shot. The horse, now panicked and half-crippled, began to turn in circles. "Hold on!" Rowan bellowed. Without a second of hesitation, he let go of his remaining rein. He unbuckled his thick leather belt from his waist, his fingers, already numb and clumsy, fumbling with the frozen metal. He lunged forward, grabbing the broken piece of the bridle. His hands were raw, the cold searing them like a brand, but his movements were driven by pure animal instinct. He looped the belt through the bridle ring, yanking the horse's head straight with a savage, desperate pull. "Push!" he roared at Tanner. He pulled, and Tanner, tears freezing on his face, pushed at the horse's haunches. With a final, convulsive surge of strength, Jeb dragged its leg from the ice's grip and lunged for the far bank. Scrambling up the slick, snowy incline, they were across. They were alive, but they were soaked, and the wind was already turning their wet clothes into armor of ice. They didn't stop. They couldn't. Back in the cabin, Maribel fought a different battle. The small house was a fortress besieged. The wind clawed at the roof and screamed down the chimney, sending puffs of smoke and ash back into the room. Every gust felt like a physical blow. "Bo!" His eyes wide with a terror he couldn't articulate, was huddled by the fire, his small body shaking. "Is Pa coming back?" he whispered, his voice small. "Is Tanner cold?" Maribel stoked the fire, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had to be the anchor. She pulled Bo onto her lap, wrapping a thick blanket around them both. Renly, blessedly unaware, was already asleep, her small body warm and heavy on Maribel's other shoulder, her breathing the only peaceful sound in the room, soft and rhythmic as the fall of a single pine nut. "Of course they are coming back," Maribel said, forcing a confidence into her voice that she did not feel. "Your Pa is the strongest man in this valley, and Tanner is just like him. They are bringing back medicine for Lark." She pulled the tattered book of fables close to the lamp. "Now, let's read about the fox and the grapes." She began to read, her voice a low, steady murmur, a human sound to ward off the inhuman shriek of the storm. She read the same story 3 times, her focus not on the words, but on the small, warm weights in her lap. She was holding the fragile center of this family together, a small, flickering flame of life against a universe of cold. She prayed, not to a distant god, but to Rowan, to his strength, to his stubborn will to survive. Hours passed, an eternity measured in the rising and falling of Lark's feverish breaths and the howling of the wind. It was well past dark when the door was flung open. They didn't walk in. They fell in, a single, frozen entity, collapsing onto the floor in a cloud of snow and ice. Rowan and Tanner, their faces invisible beneath masks of frost, their lips a frightening shade of purple-gray. Maribel moved, depositing the sleeping children onto the rug and leaping to the door, slamming it shut against the storm. "The stove!" she commanded, her voice sharp with urgency. She grabbed Rowan's arm, her hands recoiling from the shocking cold. His coat was a solid block of ice. She hauled him, and he dragged Tanner with him, toward the hearth. "Get these coats off, now!" Her fingers, warm and nimble, worked at the frozen buttons and ropes, her nails breaking, her skin scraping against the ice. But she didn't care. She and Rowan worked together, peeling the frozen, rigid layers from Tanner, then from Rowan himself. The two of them were shaking so violently their teeth chattered, deep, racking shudders that seemed to come from their very bones. Maribel wrapped them in every dry blanket in the house, pushing them so close to the stove their clothes steamed. She grabbed handfuls of snow from the bucket by the door and began to rub their frozen hands, her movements brisk and painful, forcing the blood back to the surface. Tanner cried out, a thin, sharp sound of agony as his nerves came back to life. Rowan just watched her, his eyes bloodshot and sunken in his frozen face, fixed on hers. He tried to speak, but his jaw was too stiff. He simply looked at her, and in that single, exhausted gaze, a lifetime passed. It was a look that went deeper than any touch, a look of profound, agonizing gratitude. He had seen the sleeping children by the fire. He had seen Lark, still breathing, still fighting. He had seen the fortress she had held, and she, in turn, saw the impossible journey he had taken, the price he had paid to return. It was a look that lasted no longer than a single heartbeat, but it forged a bond between them that was stronger than steel. The medicine. Rowan finally rasped, his frozen lips barely moving. He nodded toward his coat pocket. Maribel retrieved a small, damp, deer-hide pouch. Inside were a handful of dark, dried leaves. She crushed them, as Rowan instructed, and steeped them in hot water, the cabin filling with a sharp, earthy, and unfamiliar scent. She spent the next hour coaxing the dark, bitter tea, drop by drop, between Lark's cracked lips. For a long time, nothing changed. The fever still raged. The child still tossed. Maribel sat, her hand on Lark's chest, feeling the frantic, hammering beat of her heart, praying to a medicine she didn't understand. And then, near midnight, it happened. A single bead of sweat appeared on Lark's forehead, then another on her temple. The dry, burning heat of her skin gave way to a drenching, cleansing sweat. Her frantic breathing eased. Her limbs, which had been rigid, went slack. She fell into a deep, natural, healing sleep. The fever had broken. Maribel slumped over the child's cot, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion, and wept. Silent, racking sobs of pure, unadulterated relief. She kissed Lark's damp forehead and whispered a hoarse thank you into the quiet, warm air. Later, when the children were all sleeping peacefully, the storm outside still howling, Maribel found Rowan by the fire, his hands, red and blistered, wrapped around a cup of hot coffee. It was a fool's errand, he said quietly, staring into the flames. I almost lost us both. I almost left you here alone with them. It was an apology, a confession of his own terror. Maribel came and stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She watched the fire, the only light in the room, dance in his tired eyes. If it were them, she said, her voice just as quiet. If it were Lark or Beau, or any of them, you would go again. You wouldn't even hesitate. She turned her head, meeting his gaze, and so would I. He looked at her, truly seeing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. She was not a fragile visitor. She was a survivor, just like him. She understood the primal, non-negotiable laws of protection that he lived by. It was an understanding that needed no more words, a covenant carved deep into their bones. The night wore on. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, burying the ranch in a deep, white silence. The wind finally died, its fury spent. Inside the small, warm cabin, there was only the sound of the children's breathing and the soft crackle of the fire. Rowan and Maribel sat in the silence, two sentinels sharing a watch, their shadows, cast by the low fire, stretched and merged on the rough-hewn wall, becoming one. The family had survived its first battle, a battle against the raw, impersonal violence of the land. The heartbeat of the house slowed, grew stronger, more unified. But as Maribel looked out the small, clear patch on the frosted window, she knew this was only a reprieve. The storm, for all its fury, was a clean fight, an enemy without malice. The threat posed by Silas Duval and Horace Milligan, however, was a different kind of cold. It was a lead-gray cloud massing on the horizon, patient and heavy, just waiting for the right moment to strike. The thaw was as brutal as the storm. For 3 days, the world was a blinding white, and then, under a relentless, pale sun, it began to weep. The snow melted into a thick, treacherous slurry of mud and ice that made the roads impassable. But as soon as the path to Half Moon Ford was visible, a muddy, half-frozen scar on the landscape, Maribel went. Rowan stayed, his presence a non-negotiable shield for the children, and Tanner, his gaze steady, took up his post, rifle in hand, watching the ridge line. Maribel rode the gentler of their two horses, her mind a cold, clear mechanism. She was not just a teacher anymore. She was an investigator, a protector. The 10 miles to the small settlement, a journey that would have taken 2 hours, took nearly 5. The horses' hooves punched through the crust of the snow, sinking deep into the mud beneath, each step a struggle. She found Alma Thistle in a small, tidy cabin on the edge of the creek, the air inside thick with the smell of dried herbs, camphor, and wood smoke. Alma was an old woman, her body bent and gnarled by a long life of hard work and harder winters. But her eyes, behind small spectacles, were sharp and missed nothing. "I expected you," Alma said, her voice a dry rustle. She gestured for Maribel to sit by the fire. "Not you, perhaps, but someone. When the wind blows that hard, it always knocks something loose." Maribel, shedding her snow-caked cloak, explained the situation. She spoke of the fire, the fake tax bill, and the threat to the children. She didn't plead or embellish. She laid out the facts as she would a medical chart. Alma listened, her hands knotted with arthritis. Never stop _ping their work of sorting dried beans. "Silas Duval," she said, the name a sour taste in her mouth. "And Horace Milligan, a snake and a weasel. They've wanted that basin for years. Thought Rowan Pike was too stubborn and too poor to fight. Now he has you. That changes the arithmetic." "I need proof, Mrs. Thistle," Maribel said, her voice low. "Rowan has only promises. They say promises aren't law. I was told you keep a ledger." Alma stopped sorting. She looked at Maribel for a long moment. "The law," she scoffed. "The law in this territory is whatever the man with the most money or the fastest gun says it is. But yes, I keep the book. Not for the law, mind you, for God. He likes a clean record." She rose with a groan and moved to a large, dark wooden chest. From it, she lifted a massive, leather-bound book, its cover warped by time and damp. She laid it on the table with a heavy thud, dust rising in the beam of light from the window. "Find what you need," she said. Maribel opened the cover. The pages were thick, the ink faded from black to a rusty brown. Alma's handwriting, even years ago, was a shaky, spidery script. Maribel's heart sank. Would this be dismissed as the ramblings of an old woman? She turned the pages, her fingers tracing the names of the dead, the born, the lost, and then she found them. August 14th, 1886. Cholera camp, wagon train from Ohio. Attended Sarah and Jacob Miller. Both passed. Left behind 2 infants, boy and girl. Healthy. Given to Mr. Rowan Pike, who was trading, as an act of Christian mercy. Father unknown to God. Her fingers trembled. She kept turning. January 2nd, 1884. Blizzard. Attended Eliza Tanner. Found in a snowdrift. Died of exposure. Her son, Tanner. Approx. 4 years. Given to Mr. Rowan Pike at her dying request. Father unknown. May 5th, 1888. Infant girl left on church steps. Sagebrush. Given to Mr. R. Pike by pastor. Child is healthy. Father unknown. The entries were short, stark, and devastating. Father unknown. Act of mercy. Dying request. It was exactly as Rowan had said, but it was written. It was dated. It was witnessed by the woman who had been there. "The writing is—" Maribel hesitated. "It's shaky." Alma finished for her, her voice sharp. "My hands have always been unsteady, child, but my eyes are clear. I write what I see. That book is the truest thing in this county. It is legal because it is the truth." Maribel made careful, exact copies of each entry, her own handwriting a stark, clear contrast to Alma's. As she was leaving, Alma placed a gnarled hand on her arm. "Be careful," she warned. "You're holding facts, and facts are a dangerous thing to men who live by lies." In Half Moon Ford's small mercantile, while waiting for the shopkeeper to wrap a small parcel of salt, Maribel overheard the talk. It was the same topic that buzzed in every settlement the Red Meridian Railroad. "Heard Duval's not just surveying," a man in a buffalo coat said to the shopkeeper. "He's been buying up land debt, cheap." "Is that right?" the shopkeeper replied, not looking up. "Aye, heard he bought that worthless paper Horace Milligan was holding on the Pike Ranch. Got it for pennies on the dollar." Maribel froze, her back to them. "But the railroad ain't even going through the basin, is it?" the shopkeeper asked. "Thought it was going south." The man gave a low chuckle. "That's the smart part. It is going through the basin. They're not just laying track. See, they're planning a full, technical depot right in the middle of that valley. Needs the flat land, and it needs the water from Redwater Creek. That land ain't worthless. It's the whole prize. A technical depot, a small city of iron, steam, and men, right on top of Rowan's home, right on top of the children. Now the fire, the stampede, the fake tax bill, it all clicked into place. It was a coordinated, ruthless campaign to seize the land, and the children were just leverage." Her next stop was the county courthouse in Sagebrush Hollow, a proud, new-built wooden structure that smelled of sawdust and self-importance. The county clerk, a sallow man with a green eyeshade and ink-stained cuffs, barely looked up as Maribel laid her copied pages on his desk. He scanned them, his lips curling in a faint sneer. "And what is this, ma'am?" "These are records, sir, from the midwife Alma Thistle. They are proof of how Rowan Pike came to be the guardian of his children." The clerk, whose nameplate read E. Flinch, pushed the papers back toward her. "This is not a court document. This is a diary. As for guardianship, the Montana Territory has strict procedures. Petitions must be filed. Fees must be paid. These promises to the dying." He gave a delicate, insulting laugh. "That is not how the law works. I see no legal standing here. But the tax bill sent to him was fraudulent," Maribel insisted, her voice rising. "The county assessor, Horace Milligan." Flinch's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly cold and sharp. "You are making a very serious accusation against a duly appointed official, Miss Sloane. A very serious accusation." He leaned forward, lowering his voice, and the air filled with the sour smell of corruption. "Mr. Pike is in a precarious position. The county is, in fact, reviewing the status of all unproven land claims, especially those with irregular households, if he wishes to secure his claim." He tapped the desk with an inky finger. "Perhaps a special petition fee could be filed to ensure the paperwork is in order. A bribe. He was asking for a bribe. Right here, in the House of Law." Nauseated, Maribel fled. She went to the one man who was supposed to be separate from the corruption. She found Sheriff Pratt in his office, boots up on his desk, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. She told him everything: the ledger, the depot, the clerk's demand for a special fee. Pratt listened with a look of profound boredom. When she finished, he slowly folded his knife and tucked it away. "Miss Sloane," he said, in the tone of a man explaining something simple to a child, "you are a schoolteacher. You should stick to books." "But this is illegal," she insisted, her hands clenched. "What's illegal?" Pratt said, dropping his feet to the floor with a thud. "Is making trouble. Silas Duval is bringing the future to this territory. He is bringing jobs, money, and progress. He is a very important man. And you." He stood up, his bulk suddenly menacing in the small room. "And Rowan Pike, and a handful of stray children. You are not." He walked to the door and held it open for her. His voice dropped to a low, flat whisper. "I am a neutral party here, so I'm going to give you some friendly advice. As a neutral man, stop stirring. This pot, don't make trouble for Mr. Duval. Not if you want to stay in one piece. Not if Pike wants to keep those children at all. Am I understood?" The threat was unmistakable. The law was not just blind. It was actively working against them. That night, the ranch felt like a trap. Maribel sat at the kitchen table long after the children were asleep. The house was silent, but she could hear the ticking of the clock, the distant cry of a coyote, and the pounding of her own heart. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and her pen. She had heard of one person, a story from a freighter, a name spoken with a mix of fear and awe in Helena. Hester Quince, a widow, an attorney, a woman who, it was said, hated cheats and bullies more than she feared God. Mar. She wrote, "My name is Maribel Sloane. I am writing to you on behalf of a rancher named Rowan Pike and his 4 adopted children." She poured out the entire story onto the page: the land, the fire, the fraudulent tax bill, the midwife's ledger, the depot, the clerk's bribe, the sheriff's threat. She wrote with the cool precision of a nurse detailing a disease, but with the desperate passion of a mother protecting her young. She enclosed her last dollar for postage and a reply. A few days later, Rowan decided they must thank Elder Two Branches for the medicine that had saved Lark. They rode to Redwater Creek together, bringing a sack of precious flour and tobacco. The elder accepted the gifts with a quiet nod, his ancient eyes seeing the new, heavy burden they carried. They sat outside his lodge, the air sharp and clean. Rowan, in his own spare words, explained the new threat, not of the storm, but of the law. Elder Two Branches listened, his gaze on the valley below, on the creek that was the lifeblood of the basin. "This place," he said, his voice slow, "has always been a place of passage. The herds pass. My people, we passed. The wagons pass." He turned his gaze to Rowan. "Now the iron horse comes, but it does not wish to pass. It wishes to stay. It wishes to possess the water, and the land, and the sky." He looked at Maribel. "The man who counts money. His ears are full of metal. He cannot hear the wind. He cannot hear the water. He cannot hear the truth in a child's voice. He hears only the clink of a coin." He offered them a thin, kind smile. "Be strong. He is fighting for a piece of paper. You are fighting for a home." The elder's wisdom, his deep, kind respect, settled them, but the fear remained. That night, Rowan could not rest. He stood by the window, a large, dark silhouette against the moonlight on the snow. Maribel was mending Tanner's shirt, the blue gingham one, her stitches small and even. "If it comes to court," Rowan said, his voice rough, his back still to her, "they will tear us apart." Maribel looked up. "We have Alma's book." "It's not enough," he said, turning to her. His face, in the lamplight, was a mask of raw anguish, a vulnerability she had never seen. "You don't understand. Maribel, this isn't about the land anymore. It's about them." He gestured to the sleeping cots. "Duval's lawyer will stand up. He will look at me, and he will ask the one question that matters. Mr. Pike, are these children your blood?" His hands clenched into massive, white-knuckled fists. "And I have to say no. I have no blood to give them. I have no answer to that question. All I have is promises to the dead. What is that to a judge who's already been paid?" It was his deepest, darkest fear, spoken aloud, that his love, his work, his sweat, none of it mattered against the simple, cold fact of blood. Maribel put the mending down. She stood and walked to him, stopping just short of touching him. Her heart ached for him, for this strong, silent man so terrified of his own love being found inadequate. "Then we will give them a different answer," she said, her voice quiet. But it did not tremble. It was as solid as the iron stove. "When they ask if they are your blood, you will say no." She took a breath, and then she did the one thing she had not dared to do. She reached out and laid her hand flat on his forearm, on the rough, calloused, trembling muscle. "And then you will tell them the truth, that you are their home, that you are their father." She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "We have documents, we have witnesses, we have the truth, and we will build a wall of it. Rowan, we will build it so high they can never get over it." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then into her eyes. He didn't speak, but she felt the tremor in his arm begin to still. As he turned from the window, his gaze fell upon the children's slate, hanging on a nail by the stove. Lark, who now practiced her letters every day, had drawn a picture. It was simple, the way a child draws. It was a large, swirling cloud of chalk, and beneath it there were 6 figures: a tall man, a woman in a dress beside him, and 4 smaller figures, all of them connected, their chalk hands linked in an unbreakable chain. Rowan stepped closer. He stared at the drawing, at the 6 of them, standing together against the storm. This was Lark's answer. This was the testimony. His shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, slowly straightened. The despair in his eyes was burned away by a cold, sudden fire. This was his family, and he would, he realized, burn the world down before he let anyone touch them. They waited. The tension in the house was a string pulled taut. Every rider on the horizon was a threat. Every knock a summons. A week passed, then 2. Maribel's hope began to fade. Then the freighter from Helena arrived. He handed Rowan not a letter, but a thick, heavy envelope of expensive cardstock. It was addressed in a bold, black script to Mr. Rowan Pike, by way of Sagebrush Hollow. Rowan's hands were too large, too unsteady, to open it. He handed it to Maribel. She broke the wax seal. The letterhead was Stark Hester Quince, attorney at law. The letter was not long. It was not gentle. It was a weapon. Mr. Pike, I have received Miss Sloane's meticulous and alarming summary. The actions of Milligan, Flinch, and Pratt represent a clear conspiracy of fraud and intimidation. I am in agreement, Mr. Duval wants your water. We will not let him have it. I have already filed an injunction against the county. They have chosen to fight with fraudulent paper and veiled threats. We will reply with the law. And with the truth, I require you to gather testimony from every neighbor who has seen you with your children. I have attached my initial strategy. I call it clean payback. I arrive on the 10th. Do not speak to anyone. H. Quince. Hester Quince arrived not in a delicate carriage, but on the back of a mud-spattered, iron-gray gelding, riding astride like a man. She was a woman in her 50s, wrapped in a practical black wool cloak, her face weathered by the high plains wind, but her eyes were like 2 chips of obsidian sharp, dark, and missing nothing. She dismounted with a stiff grace, looked at the small ranch house, the scorched barn, and the 4 children watching her from the porch, and gave a single, satisfied nod. She looked like a field general arriving to inspect a fortification. Mr. Pike, Miss Sloane." Her voice was exactly as Maribel had imagined, low, resonant, and carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. She accepted a cup of coffee but did not sit by the fire. She preferred to stand in the center of the room, her presence seeming to shrink the space, turning the small cabin into a war room. "The hearing is set for the 25th, she began, wasting no time on pleasantries. "Judge Harlan is presiding. He is an old, distractible man, but he is not owned by the railroad, which is our primary advantage. Mr. Duval's attorneys will paint you, Mr. Pike, as an unfit, indigent squatter. They will paint your children as wild orphans in need of state protection. Our job," she said, fixing Maribel with an appreciative gaze, "is to prove you are a father, and that they are a family. We will not do this with sentiment. We will do it with facts. We will bury them in a mountain of facts so high they will not be able to breathe." Her strategy was a clean, multi-pronged attack. "First, we fight the lie of your character. Mr. Pike, you are a silent man. We must make your actions speak for you." Rowan, who disliked this talk, shifted by the stove. "I don't ask for charity." "This is not charity," Hester said, her voice cutting. "This is capital. For years, you have mended your neighbors' fences, tracked their lost cattle, and shared your stores. In this territory, Mr. Pike, that is the coin of the realm. It is time to call in your accounts, not for money, but for words." So Rowan rode out. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Not the work, but the asking. He didn't ask for signatures. That wasn't his way. He just appeared. He found Jonah Cade, the blacksmith. His broad back knotted as he struggled with the warped axle of a heavy freight wagon. Rowan didn't speak. He just picked up the spare sledgehammer. And for an hour, the ringing of their two hammers in unison was the only sound in the forge. When they finished, Jonah wiped his face with a sooty arm. "Heard that railroad man, Duval, hired someone to burn you out. Rowan, heard they're trying to take your land and say you're unfit to raise them youngins." Rowan just nodded, coiling a rope he'd been meaning to return. "Well," Jonah growled, spitting on the forge floor. "You tell that fancy lady lawyer of yours. You tell her Jonah Cade will be at that hearing. And I'll be telling the judge just who it was that pulled my wagon from the mud last spring when the creek flooded, and who refused to take $1 for it. It was the same at every ranch. He didn't ask. He just worked. He rehung a heavy gate for the widow Sims. He helped another neighbor track a steer that had wandered into the Badlands. He mended a saddle for the pastor, and in the quiet, functional language of the West, he was reminding them of the bonds of community. Favors, as Hester had predicted, were becoming hard social capital. While Rowan fortified their reputation, Hester and Maribel moved to collect the hard evidence. They rode to Sagebrush Hollow, securing a sworn signed affidavit from May Whitlow in the Mercantile, who testified with flushed indignation about Rowan's tender care for the children and Maribel's role in their education. They visited the circuit pastor, who provided a copy of the church register, confirming the dates Alma Thistle had given for Renly's arrival. Their most important visit was to Elder Two Branches. He received Hester Quince with a grave courtesy, listening to her legal explanations without expression. When she finished and asked for his testimony, he did not sign a paper. Instead, he led her to the edge of Redwater Creek. He pointed to a large, ancient willow. "This branch is one," he said, touching a thick limb. "But its roots are many, and they hold the bank together against the flood. So it is with this family. I will come," he promised. "I will speak." Hester's second line of attack was aimed directly at the enemy. She rode into the courthouse with the force of a northern gale and filed a formal counterclaim, a move that shocked the placid county clerk. "We are not merely defending Mr. Flinch," she announced, her voice echoing in the dusty room. "We are accusing—" The suit named Horace Milligan for willful misconduct, conspiracy to defraud, and the collection of illegal taxes. Crucially, it included a subpoena duces tecum for all of Milligan's financial records, specifically demanding to see any and all transfers of funds from the Red Meridian Railroad, its agents, or any holding companies affiliated with Mr. Silas Duval. This was the first move that drew blood, a direct shot at the conspiracy's money trail. Next, Hester took the scorched, fraudulent tax notice, the one the arsonist had dropped not to the sheriff, but to Jonah Cade. "Jonah," she said, "you are a man of metal. Tell me about this." She pointed to the official embossed seal on the corner of the paper. The blacksmith ran his thick, calloused thumb over the indentation. He squinted, took the paper to the light, and then fetched a small lens. He went to his tool wall and took down a heavy, official-looking embossing tool. "This is a county seal. All right," he said, "but it's not Horace's." "How can you be certain?" Hester asked. "The cutter," Jonah said, pointing to the die. "The tool that makes this impression, Horace's seal is old, got a nick in the upper left corner, right on the eagle's wing. Been there for 5 years. I know, 'cause he asked me to fix it, and I told him it was too brittle." He held the scorched paper back up to the light. This one, the one from your fire. It's perfect. The edges are too clean. This is a forgery, ma'am, a brand new one. Hester now had her weapons a conspiracy claim and proof of a felony. Her final move was on the chessboard's weakest link, Sheriff Pratt. She marched into his office, where he was, as usual, whittling at his desk. She didn't sit. "Sheriff," she said, her voice as cold as a gun barrel. "I am told you are a neutral man." Pratt looked up, wary. "That's right, Mrs. Quince. I take no sides." "Good," Hester said. "Then you will have no trouble obeying the law." She placed Jonah Cade's sworn affidavit about the forged seal on his desk. "This is proof of a felony, forgery, committed in your jurisdiction." He stared at it, his whittling stopping. She then placed Alma Thistle's affidavit on top of it. "This is the true, sworn history of the Pike children. I am filing it with the court, but I am giving you a copy, so you are aware of the facts." Pratt's face began to pale. "Now," Hester continued, leaning forward, her hands flat on his desk, "you are going to be subpoenaed in our case. You will be asked, under oath, what you observed at the Pike Ranch after the fire. You will be asked about this forged document. You will be asked about Mr. Milligan's activities." She lowered her voice. "You have two choices. Sheriff, you can tell the truth, cooperate with our investigation into this fraud, and confirm your suspicions as a neutral officer of the law. Or you can lie on the stand to protect Mr. Milligan and Mr. Duval. And when I prove you lied, and I will prove it, I will see you in a federal prison for perjury and conspiracy. You will lose more than your job, sir. You will lose your freedom." She smiled, a cold, thin expression that held no humor. "You sign wrong. You go to jail. Now, how neutral do you feel?" Pratt was trapped. He had been bullied by Duval, but this was different. This was a legal cage. He saw his entire lazy life collapsing. He chose the side that seemed, suddenly, more likely to win. What do you need?" he stammered, putting his knife down. "A warrant," Hester said, her voice sharp and triumphant. "A warrant to search Horace Milligan's office, for his tax ledgers, his seals, and his private correspondence. And I want you to serve it, personally." While the legal hammer was being prepared, Maribel and Hester staged their final, brilliant piece of public theater. They needed to ensure the town was on their side before the hearing. Maribel organized a community reading day in the town square. It was a clear, cold afternoon. Maribel, using the new books from May Whitlow, had the Pike children stand on the steps of the Mercantile. A crowd gathered, curious. They watched as Maribel, her voice clear and calm, pointed to the book. "Bo, what is this word?" "C-O-W, cow," Bo shouted, beaming with pride. They listened as Lark, her voice soft but sure, read a full paragraph about a girl planting a garden, her pronunciation perfect, and they watched in near silence as Tanner, the quiet, watchful boy, stood tall and read a passage from a book of fables, his voice strong and steady. When he finished, he looked not at the crowd, but at Maribel, and said, "Thank you, ma'am, for teaching me." The townspeople, who had watched this family struggle, who had seen Rowan's quiet acts of service, who had witnessed the fire, were completely won over. This was not a band of strays. This was a family. The public opinion was no longer divided. It was a solid wall of support behind the Pikes. The next day, the final move was played. Sheriff Pratt, his face a mask of nervous resolve, served the warrant on a sputtering, indignant Horace Milligan. Hester Quince walked in behind him, her eyes scanning the office. Milligan blustered and threatened, but Pratt, his own freedom on the line, pushed him aside. Hester ignored the stacks of papers. She went straight to the large, pin-bound tax ledger on the main desk. "This is a double-entry book, isn't it, Horace?" she said, her fingers flying over the pages. "One for the public and one for your private accounts." She found the section for the dry willow basin. She ran her finger down the list, and there it was. Lot 407, the Pike Ranch. But the page looked wrong. It was too clean. The pinholes where the binding held it were new, not frayed like the others. "This page has been replaced," she stated. "I don't know what you're talking about," Milligan yelped. Hester smiled. She examined the thick spine of the ledger, and she saw it. A tiny scrap of paper, the corner of the original page, still trapped deep in the book's binding where Milligan had carelessly torn it out. She dug it free with her fingernail. It was a small, faded blue scrap. On it was a single line of ink, Lot 407, Pike, R. And next to it, a date and a stamp. Tax paid in full, 1887. Rowan had paid. He had never been delinquent at all. The entire claim was a fabrication. "Sheriff," Hester said, her voice booming with triumph. "Arrest this man for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy." The arrest of the county assessor sent a shockwave through the territory. The hearing was no longer just a custody battle. It was a criminal conspiracy case. Silas Duvall received his summons at the Sagebrush Hotel. He was not being called as a witness. He was being named as a co-conspirator. He was in the lobby, enjoying a cigar. When the deputy delivered it, he calmly read the document, the smile never leaving his face. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. He saw Maribel, who had been waiting across the street, watching, and who now entered the lobby, her hands clasped in front of her. Duvall stood, adjusting his silk tie, his demeanor one of absolute, patronizing confidence. "You've caused quite a stir, little lady," he sneered, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. "A schoolteacher, a half-broke rancher, and a bitter old widow in a pantsuit. You truly believe you can stop the Red Meridian Railroad?" He gestured to the window. "You cannot stop progress, Miss Sloane." Maribel stood her ground. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze as calm and steady as the prairie horizon. "We are not fighting the railroad, Mr. Duvall," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet lobby, silencing the whispers. "We are fighting what is wrong, and we will win." The house was profoundly still. It was a silence that felt heavy, a quiet that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the dawn and the judgment it would bring. Outside, the world was scrubbed clean. The long, violent blizzard had finally passed, giving way to a night of crystalline, breathless cold. A sharp sliver of moon hung in a sky so black it looked like a tear in the fabric of the universe, and the stars were hard, indifferent pinpricks of light. The massive snowdrifts, piled high against the cabin walls, glowed with a faint, blue luminescence. Inside, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic breathing of the 4 children, Tanner and Bo in their cots, Lark and Renly sharing the larger trundle bed, a tangle of small limbs and heavy wool blankets. They were safe, for now, lost in the uncomplicated oblivion of sleep. The stove, which had been a roaring beast of defense against the storm, was now banked low for the night. The only light in the main room came from its small, metal-grated door, casting a shifting, warm red glow on the floorboards and the underside of the table. The air was cool, but not cold, the hearth's embers a defiant pulse of life against the vast, frozen landscape. Maribel was not asleep. She sat at the long kitchen table, which had been transformed from a place of meals to a command center. It was covered with the weapons of their new war, Hester Quince's bold, black-inked strategy, Alma Thistle's sworn affidavit, the crumbling, precious page from the church register, Jonah Cade's technical testimony about the forged seal, and her own meticulous copies of the midwife's ledger. She was organizing them, stacking them in the precise order Hester had demanded for the morning. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion had settled into her marrow, but her mind was a spinning wheel, refusing to rest, replaying every possible question. every potential legal trap. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, rubbing away the ache, and then looked at her fingers in the firelight. They were smudged with black ink, the dried, permanent-looking stains of her battle. For days, she had been the one to write and rewrite their story, their truth, their testimonies, until her knuckles ached and her vision blurred. A floorboard groaned near the back door. She looked up, startled, her hand moving instinctively to cover the precious papers, her heart leaping into her throat. Rowan stood there. He hadn't been asleep either. He had been outside, in the biting 0-degree air, perhaps checking on the livestock one last time, or perhaps just pacing the perimeter of his land, a sentinel unable to stand down on the eve of the invasion. He stepped back into the cabin, closing the door with a quiet, practiced click, bringing a sharp, clean scent of frost and pine with him. He had shed his heavy sheepskin coat. His chambray shirt, the one she had mended the night before the storm, was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the strong, tired line of his throat. His dark hair was damp and pushed back from his forehead, glistening in the red light, as if he'd just splashed icy water on his face from the basin by the door, trying to shock himself awake, or perhaps to calm the nerves that were surely thrumming just beneath his skin. His eyes, in the dim light, were dark pools of exhaustion and unresolved fear. He didn't speak at first. He just moved to the stove, his boots heavy but quiet on the wood. He took a single, small log from the wood box and nudged it into the embers. They hissed and crackled in response, a brief, bright flare of orange light illuminating his face. It was a face carved by sun and worry, and in that moment, she saw the terrible weight he was carrying. "You should be sleeping," Maribel said, her voice a low murmur, careful not to break the fragile peace of the sleeping house. "So should you," he rumbled, his back still to her. He watched the new flames lick the wood. "I can't," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I keep rereading the papers, as if I'll find a new word, a new defense. I can't stop thinking about tomorrow, about that courtroom, about that judge." Rowan turned, his broad frame a solid silhouette against the new, brighter flicker of the fire. "Hester is a good fighter. The evidence is strong." His voice was low, meant to reassure. "I know," Maribel whispered. She looked down at her ink-stained hands, clenched on the table. "But the law, it's so cold. Rowan, it doesn't talk about love. It doesn't talk about mending shirts or singing lullabies. It talks about standing and claims. It talks about blood." She finally looked up, meeting his gaze across the dim room. "Tomorrow, Duval's lawyers are going to stand up, and they're going to try and tell that judge that this, all of this, our family without blood, isn't real, that it doesn't count." It was the first time either of them had given the fear its true name. In the past, their conversations had been clipped, fragmented, functional, interrupted by chores, or the storm, or a child's cry. Now, in the heavy, expectant silence of the night, the sentence was spoken, whole and terrible. It hung in the air between them. Rowan walked slowly to the table. He didn't sit. He stood opposite her, looking down at the stack of papers that held their fate. His large, scarred hand rested on the wood, near hers. "It's real," he said, his voice rough with a conviction that was absolute, a conviction that came from a place deeper than law. "It's realer than that courthouse. It's realer than their railroad. It's the only real thing I've ever known." He looked at her, his gaze so direct, so unguarded, it felt more intimate than any touch. A shiver ran through her, a profound tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the terrifying, physical weight of hope. It was the sudden, crushing realization of how much was at stake. If they lost, they didn't just lose a piece of land. They lost this quiet room, this home. They lost each other. Rowan saw her tremble. His expression, usually so guarded, so stoic, softened in the warm light. A different man might have offered a blanket or a simple platitude. Rowan, his heart finally unlocked, offered the truth. "I was alone for a long time," he said, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him, the world shrinking to the small, illuminated space between them. "I thought that was just how it was meant to be. This land, the children, it was just about surviving, holding on, keeping things from falling apart." He looked at her, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw, the weariness at the corners of her mouth. I've never wanted anyone to stay before. Maribel." His voice cracked. "Just once. Not like this." The admission settled over her, a warmth that spread faster and deeper than the fire. Her breath caught in her throat, the space between them. The few feet of oaken table felt charged, electric, and infinitely small. He raised his hand. It was his right hand, the one that could calm a horse or split a log, the one she had seen soothe Renly's nightmares. She flinched, just slightly, an old, ingrained reflex from a lifetime of being wary of the world. But he was infinitely gentle. He didn't touch her arm or her shoulder. He reached toward her face. "You have ink," he whispered. His thumb, rough as sandstone but impossibly tender, brushed against the soft skin of her cheek, right beside the corner of her mouth. He was wiping away the smudge of her work, the stain of her fight. His touch was a question. Maribel stopped breathing. Everything in the world stopped. The popping embers, the distant sigh of the wind, the steady beat of her own heart. It all went silent, and in that profound, echoing silence, driven by an instinct older and deeper than all her fear, she leaned into his touch. It was a movement of only an inch, a distance that was no more than a single, skipped heartbeat. It was all the invitation he needed. He closed the distance between them. He didn't take her. He didn't demand. He met her. His mouth covered hers. The kiss was not the desperate, frantic kiss of a first passion, or the hurried, hungry kiss of stolen time. It was slow. It was deep. It was, above all, grateful. It was a kiss of profound recognition, a silent, eloquent thank you from one survivor to another. It tasted of wood smoke, of the cold night air, and of the faint, metallic tang of her own ink. It was the kiss of two people who had been starving for a home, and had, in that exact moment, found it. They were not two separate people fighting a battle. In that moment, they were the shelter itself. When he drew back, neither of them opened their eyes for a moment. Her hand, the one that had been resting on the table, found their fingers, her ink-stained ones and his calloused ones, intertwined. It was a perfect, unquestioned, and unbreakable fit. Rowan moved around the corner of the table, never letting go of her hand. He didn't pull her into a crushing, desperate embrace. Instead, he simply stood before her, drew her gently to her feet, and rested his forehead against hers. She could feel his breath, warm and steady, against her lips. She could feel the solid, unshakable strength of him, a strength that was no longer just about survival, but about pure, unyielding devotion. "Tomorrow," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that she felt more than heard, his breath mingling with hers. In that room, in front of all of them, whatever that judge says. He took a steadying breath, his own heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm standing next to you, Maribel, right next to you, no matter what comes." It was a vow. It was a promise more binding than any law, more sacred than any judge's decree. A small, choked sound escaped her, a half-sob, half-sigh of utter relief. The tension she had been carrying in her shoulders for weeks, the rigid, protective posture she had held for years, finally dissolved. She sagged against him, her head finding the natural, perfect hollow of his shoulder, her cheek pressing against the warm, rough fabric of his shirt. She tilted her head, her ear over his heart, and just listened. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of his life. Steady and strong and present, her own clenched fists, the ones she hadn't even realized were tight, finally uncurled, her palms resting flat against the solid muscle of his chest. Her body was speaking a language she hadn't known she'd forgotten, a language of trust, of release, of absolute safety. They stood like that for a long time, two quiet figures in the firelight, the world and its threats held at bay by the circle of their arms. From the stove, the log Rowan had added finally caught. A pocket of sap burst, and a bright ember popped. A sharp, cheerful crack in the stillness. It sounded, absurdly, like a single person clapping. A small, startled laugh bubbled up in Maribel's throat, a sound of pure, surprised joy. Rowan heard it, felt it against his chest, and he answered with a low, rumbling chuckle of his own. It was a shared, private sound, a moment of impossible lightness on the eve of the heaviest day of their lives. She tilted her head back to look up at him. The firelight carved planes and shadows on his strong, earnest face. She saw the weariness there, but it was now eclipsed by a fierce, protective love. And she said his name, not as Mr. Pike the rancher, not as Pa the father, but as the man. "Rowan," she whispered. It was the first time she had used it with such clear, simple intimacy, a claim all its own. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if savoring the sound. He replied, his voice just as soft, giving her back her own name, a name that suddenly felt new and whole and cherished. Maribel. He said it not as a label, but as an answer. It was the sound of a door, long barred and rusted shut, swinging open on newly oiled hinges. He reached for the heavy wool blanket that had been draped over his chair, the one he had wrapped Tanner in after the ride to Redwater Creek. He shook it out and, with one arm still firmly around her waist, he wrapped it around both of their shoulders, pulling her impossibly closer. They stood enveloped in the shared warmth, a single, unified shape, two people rooted to the same spot. The firelight cast their joined shadow, large and steady, upon the rough-hewn wooden wall. It was a shadow of two people who had, against all odds, become one. It was a promise, made in the sacred quiet of the night, of a future that would, from this moment on, be faced together. It was intimate, it was respectful, and it was unbreakable. The largest room in the county courthouse, normally used for town meetings and socials, had been converted into a makeshift courtroom. It was packed. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, nervous sweat, and the faint, ever-present scent of wood smoke that clung to everyone's clothes. Every bench was full, and a line of men stood 3 deep along the back wall, their hats held respectfully in their hands. They were ranchers, shopkeepers, and blacksmiths, the entire community of Sagebrush Hollow, drawn by a drama that was more compelling than any traveling show. They were here to bear witness. At a long table at the front sat Silas Duval, looking utterly unperturbed. He was dressed in an expensive, tailored city suit, a stark slash of black against the room's sea of homespun brown and gray. He looked like a crow that had wandered into a flock of sparrows. Beside him, Horace Milligan fidgeted, his face pale and slick with perspiration, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered rat. At the opposing table sat Rowan and Maribel. Rowan was a stone mountain in his best, clean shirt, his hands resting, still and massive, on his knees. Maribel, her face composed and resolute, sat straight-backed, a small, organized stack of papers before her. Hester Quint stood beside them, a black-clad general, her obsidian eyes taking in every detail, the nervous cough of the clerk, the weary posture of the judge, the angry set of Jonah Cade's jaw in the front row. Sheriff Pratt, looking deeply uncomfortable, sat on the witness bench, his gaze fixed on the floor. Judge Harlan, a man whose weary face looked like a crumpled map of the territory, peered over his spectacles. Mrs. Quince, he said, his voice a dry rustle. "You may begin." Hester moved with a quiet, deliberate confidence. "Your Honor," she began, her voice filling the room, clear and cold as winter water. "We are here today because Mr. Silas Duval and the Red Meridian Railroad wish to acquire Mr. Rowan Pike's land. To do so, they and their associate, Mr. Horace Milligan, have engaged in a campaign of fraud, intimidation, and attempted arson. They now seek to compound these crimes by petitioning this court to remove Mr. Pike's 4 children from his care, claiming he is an unfit guardian." She paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. "We will prove today not only that their claim is baseless, but that it is the final act in a criminal conspiracy. We will begin with the truth of the Pike family." She laid her first exhibits on the judge's bench, a series of methodical, damning blows. Exhibit A, an affidavit from Alma Thistle, the registered midwife of Half Moon Ford, and her personal ledger, detailing the births, deaths, and circumstances under which Mr. Pike took in the children known as Lark and Bo Miller. She then presented the church records for Renly and the pastor's sworn testimony about Eliza Tanner's dying request. She followed it with the elder's signed statement. Exhibit B, testimony from Elder 2 branches of the Absolute, a respected spiritual leader, confirming the historical context of these events. Exhibit C, the fraudulent tax notice delivered to Mr. Pike, and Exhibit D, the actual page from Mr. Milligan's tax ledger, proving Mr. Pike's taxes were, in fact, paid in full. Duval's lawyer, a slick, well-fed man named Abernathy, rose smoothly to his feet. "Objection. Your Honor, while this local history is compelling, it is irrelevant. The central fact remains not a single one of these children bears the surname Pike. They are not his blood. They are wards of the territory. And my client is simply acting in the public interest by questioning this irregular and undocumented arrangement." "The law of the Montana Territory, Mr. Abernathy," Hester shot back, her voice like cracking ice, "makes specific provision for guardianship in the public interest, which is precisely what Mr. Pike has provided for 8 years. Furthermore," she turned to the judge, "the matter of Mr. Milligan's tax collection is not local history. It is a felony. That is the very definition of relevant." The judge waved a tired hand. "Objection overruled. Proceed, Mrs. Quince." "Thank you, Your Honor." Hester turned to Maribel. "The defense calls its first witness to the character of the Pike family, Mrs. May Whitlow." One by one, they came. May Whitlow, her round face flushed with righteous anger, told the court how she had seen Rowan Pike trade a full sack of potatoes for a small bottle of cough syrup for Lark, even when his own stores were low. She spoke of how Maribel had transformed the children from shy, half-wild things into polite, inquisitive students. Next came Jonah Cade, his bulk filling the witness stand. He spoke in a low, rumbling growl about Rowan's unwavering honesty. "Rowan Pike's word," he said, fixing Duval with a hot glare, "is worth more than any railroad bond. He gives his word. He keeps it. He raised them kids right, taught 'em to work, taught 'em to be decent. That's more than blood. That's character." The pastor followed, speaking of Rowan's quiet faith and his selfless acceptance of the children nobody else wanted. Each testimony was a stone, and Hester was building a wall of truth around the family, a wall the entire town could see. "The defense now calls Sheriff Beaumont Pratt." Pratt walked to the stand as if wading through thick mud. Hester was merciless. "Sheriff, you were called to the Pike Ranch on the evening of the fire. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And did you recover the fraudulent tax notice, Exhibit C, at the scene?" It was recovered. Yes. By you." "Sheriff, Hester pressed. Pratt's eyes flickered toward Duval, then back to Hester's unblinking stare. He swallowed. "No, ma'am. Miss Sloane found it." "I see. And did you subsequently investigate the authenticity of this document?" I was making inquiries. Let me help you, Sheriff. Hester produced Jonah Cade's affidavit. Did you compare the seal on the notice to the official county seal used by Mr. Milligan? Pratt's face was slick with sweat. He was trapped. No, ma'am. Then allow me to present this, Hester said, handing him a heavy metal tool. Sheriff, can you identify this object? Pratt looked at it as if it were a snake. It's the official county embossing seal. The one I took from Mr. Milligan's office under warrant. Indeed. Now, Sheriff, would you be so kind as to make an impression of that seal on this piece of paper for the court? Pratt did, his hand trembling. Hester then laid the new impression next to the one on the fire notice. Even from across the room, the difference was clear. The forgery was perfect. The real seal had Jonah Cade's telltale nick in the eagle's wing. A low murmur ran through the courtroom. Horace Milligan looked as though he might faint. Thank you, Sheriff. Your neutrality is most illuminating, Hester said, dripping sarcasm. She then called her final witness. The defense calls Mrs. Alma Thistle. The old midwife made her way to the stand, her steps slow and shuffling, aided by Maribel on one side and Jonah Cade on the other. Her hands trembled violently as she placed them on the Bible. But when she spoke, her voice was as clear and strong as a winter bell. She didn't need prompting. She looked directly at Judge Harlan. I was there, Your Honor, the night the Miller boy was born. His mother, Sarah, was burning with the cholera. The air in that wagon smelled of soap and rain and death. Before she passed, she looked at Rowan Pike, a stranger who had brought her a bucket of clean water, and she said, You have kind eyes. Please. That's all. Please. And Rowan Pike took that baby, and his sick sister, and he didn't ask for a penny. He just promised. He kept that promise. I saw it. She turned her sharp eyes on Duval. That is a bond stronger than any piece of paper you can forge. The room was utterly silent, spellbound. And in that silence, a small, clear voice spoke up. Your Honor, may I read something? It was Lark. She was standing by her chair, her small hands clutching a folded piece of paper. Abernathy leapt to his feet. Objection, the defense is trying to turn this hearing into a circus. This is pure sentimentality. What is the document, child? The judge asked, his gaze softening as he looked at Lark. It is a letter, sir, Lark said, her voice a high, thin thread. It is a letter my teacher, Miss Sloane, wrote. It is addressed to the decider of children's fates. Duval roared with laughter. This is absurd, an emotional appeal from a child. But Hester Quince was already on her feet. Your Honor, Mr. Abernathy claims this case is about the public interest and the welfare of these children. What could be more relevant to their welfare than hearing, in their own voice, what they believe? The judge looked from Duval's angry face to Lark's pale, determined one. He sighed. The court will allow it. Proceed. Child. Lark walked to the front of the room, her small boots making no sound. Her hands shook, but she unfolded the paper and began to read. Her voice, fragile but clear, filled the silence. To the one who holds our future in his hands, she began. A family is not made of names or of blood. A family is made of moments. It is the sound of a key in the lock. It is a hand that checks your forehead for fever. It is the person who reads you a story when the world outside is dark. She continued, reading Maribel's simple, eloquent words, describing how Rowan had taught Tanner to mend a fence, how he had carried Bo home when he fell, how he had braved the storm for her. As she spoke, the legal arguments, the papers, the threats, they all faded. What was left was the simple, undeniable truth of their lives. When she finished, she simply folded the paper and said, He is our father. Then she walked back to her seat. Duval was on his feet, his face purple with rage. This is a mockery of the law sentiment. This proves nothing. On the contrary, Hester's voice cut through his tirade like a razor. It proves everything. She turned to the judge, holding up a new document. But if Mr. Duval requires proof he can understand, perhaps this will suffice. Exhibit G, Your Honor, a certified copy of a bank ledger, showing a transfer of $500, made 2 weeks before the fire, from an entity called Western Development Ventures, a known holding company of the Red Meridian Railroad, directly into the personal account of Mr. Horace Milligan. The room erupted. Horace Milligan made a small, strangled sound and slumped in his chair. Duval's face went white. He had been caught. The bribe, the motive, the conspiracy, it was all there, in black and white. Judge Harlan banged his gavel, his face a thundercloud. Order, order in this court. This hearing is recessed for 1 hour. The tension in the room broke. People surged forward, clapping Rowan on the back, hugging Maribel. Hester Quint stood, a small, triumphant smile on her face. Rowan grabbed Maribel's hand, and they pushed through the crowd, out into the cold, clean air of the town square. The snow was melting, dripping from the eaves of the courthouse, the sound like 1,000 tiny clocks ticking. The sun was out, a pale, wintry disk, but its light felt warm on their faces. Rowan didn't let go of her hand. He just stood there, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles, his gaze fixed on the mountains. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had just happened, of everything that was about to. It was solid. It was real. When they were called back in, the room was quiet, expectant. Judge Harlan looked down from his bench, his eyes no longer tired, but sharp and angry. After reviewing the evidence presented, he began, his voice booming with authority. This court finds a preponderance of evidence suggesting a criminal conspiracy. Therefore, I am ordering the immediate suspension of any and all land reclamation efforts against the property of Mr. Rowan Pike. A great, collective sigh of relief went through the room. Furthermore, I am ordering a full criminal investigation into the actions of Horace Milligan and his associates. Milligan seemed to shrink in his chair. Finally, regarding the matter of the children, this court is satisfied that they are in a safe and loving home. I will move to formally recognize the full guardianship of Mr. Rowan Pike. The room was about to explode with cheers, but they were cut short. Your Honor, if I may. Silas Duval was on his feet, his composure regained, a cold, predatory smile on his face. He held up a single, yellowed piece of paper. Before you finalize that ruling, the court may be interested in this. It appears Mr. Pike is not as solvent as he seems. This is a prior debt agreement, a contract for goods and services rendered, that predates any of his supposed tax payments, a debt that, if unpaid, cedes all rights to his land and property. He held it up for the judge to see. At the bottom of the page was a bold, familiar signature. Rowan Pike. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. The fragile hope that had blossomed moments before withered and died, replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. Rowan stared at the document in Duval's hand, his face a mask of disbelief and confusion. He didn't remember signing any such thing. Maribel's hand flew to her mouth, her heart a cold, plummeting stone. Silas Duval's smile was a slow, poisonous thing, spreading across his face as he savored his victory. He held the yellowed contract up like a winning hand in a high-stakes poker game. As you can see, Your Honor, he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. This is a simple contract for services in seed, signed by Mr. Pike 2 years ago. The terms are quite clear. Failure to repay the debt upon demand results in the forfeiture of the land and all assets thereupon. The Red Meridian Railroad has legally acquired this debt. We are now demanding payment, in full, today. The implication was clear. Without the land, Rowan had no home, no livelihood. He would be a vagrant, and no court in the territory would grant guardianship of 4 children to a landless, penniless man. It was a brilliant, cruel, final checkmate. Abernathy, Duval's lawyer, rose. Your Honor, in light of this legally binding contract, we demand an immediate summary judgment. Seize the property and place the children in the temporary custody of the county, pending a fitness hearing for which Mr. Pike is now clearly ineligible. The room was a tomb. The townspeople looked defeated. Their brief celebration turned to ash. Judge Harlan peered at the document, his brow furrowed in a deep, troubled frown. The signature was unmistakably Rowan's. Only Hester Quince remained perfectly still, her face a mask of calm, analytical concentration. While everyone else saw a final, fatal blow, she saw a new piece of evidence. She saw a mistake. Your Honor, she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the despair, may the defense examine this convenient document. Duval, overflowing with confidence, magnanimously handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to Hester. Hester did not look at the signature. She did not look at the amount. She held the paper up to the light from the tall courthouse window. She ran her thumb along its edge. Then she turned. The defense would like to recall Mr. Jonah Cade to the stand, she announced. A confused murmur went through the room. Jonah, his face a thundercloud, lumbered back to the witness box. Hester handed him the contract. Mr. Cade, she said, you are a master of your trade. You understand metal, but you also understand tools, cutters, dies. You have an eye for the marks a tool leaves behind. I ask you to look not at the words, but at the paper itself. Examine its edges. Jonah took the document, his massive hands surprisingly gentle. He held it up, squinting, his blacksmith's eyes searching for imperfections. He turned it over and over. Well, he said, his voice a low rumble, the top edge is clean, but this bottom edge, he ran a thick finger along it. This has been cut, sliced off, not with scissors, with a heavy, single-bladed knife, a trimming knife. A trimming knife, Hester prompted. Such as one might use for what purpose? For trimming pages out of a book, Jonah said, his eyes lighting with dawning comprehension. Like a ledger. And the date, Hester continued, pointing to the top of the page. It reads 1888. Does that look correct to you? Jonah pulled a small magnifying lens from his vest pocket. He peered at the ink. No, ma'am, he said, shaking his head. No, it does not. The ink is darker on the last number. The 8 is thicker. Its loop's a bit clumsy. It's been written over something else. A 3 maybe, or a 5. This date has been changed. Abernathy was on his feet. Objection, the witness is a blacksmith, not a penmanship expert. He is an expert in the marks tools leave behind, whether on iron or on paper, Hester countered. And I have one final piece of evidence to support his conclusion. She turned to Sheriff Pratt. Sheriff, would you please present the court with the ledger you seized from Mr. Milligan's office? Pratt, his face now a mask of grim duty, heaved the heavy pin-bound ledger onto the judge's bench. Hester opened it, her fingers flying to the section for the dry willow basin. She stopped at the place where lot 407 should have been, the place where she had found the small, torn scrap, the place with the fresh, clean page. Your Honor, she said, her voice ringing with triumph. Mr. Cade has testified that this contract was cut from a book with a trimming knife. Mr. Milligan's ledger is the only book in this county with such pages. He has testified that the date was altered. And now, for the final piece of the puzzle. She took the debt contract from Jonah. She walked to the judge's bench. She held it up to the ledger, aligning the bottom edge of the contract with the top of the torn page stub still caught in the binding. They fit. They fit perfectly. The small, unique tears in the paper, the pattern of the fibers, the faint water stain in the corner, it was a perfect, irrefutable match. Duval and Milligan hadn't just forged a document. They had cut a signed, blank page from the back of the old tax ledger, a page Rowan had signed years ago as a receipt, and they had built their lie upon it. The final piece of their conspiracy was the very thing that would destroy them. A collective gasp, then a roar, went up from the crowd. Judge Harlan's face was a study in pure, judicial fury. He slammed his gavel down, the sound like a gunshot. "This court has seen enough," he thundered, his voice shaking with rage. "This is not just a fraud, it is an abomination, an insult to every law-abiding citizen in this territory." He pointed a trembling finger at Duval. "Mr. Duval, your scheme is at an end. This so-called contract is declared null and void, a criminal forgery." He then turned his wrath on the cowering assessor. "Bailiff, take Mr. Horace Milligan into custody immediately on charges of fraud, forgery, and perjury." Two deputies hauled a weeping Milligan to his feet. "As for you, Mr. Duval," the judge continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, "this court is issuing a warrant for your arrest and indictment on charges of bribery, conspiracy, and suborning perjury. Your railroad may have bought men, sir, but it has not yet bought the law in my courtroom." Duval stood, his face as white as bleached bone, his mask of civility finally shattered, revealing the snarling predator beneath. He looked at Hester, at Rowan, at Maribel, with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, before the deputies escorted him away. The room exploded in a cacophony of cheers, stomping feet, and applause. It was a wave of pure, cathartic joy. Hester Quince waited for the noise to subside. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying over the din, "with the criminal matters addressed, I move that this court formally and permanently recognize the full guardianship of the children Tanner, Lark, Beau, and Renly to Mr. Rowan Pike." She paused, then looked at Maribel, a rare, warm smile touching her lips. "And I would further move to appoint Miss Maribel Sloane as co-guardian, with specific oversight of the children's education and medical welfare." "Motion granted," the judge boomed, banging his gavel one last time. "This hearing is adjourned." It was over. The dam of emotion finally broke. The four children, who had been sitting, wide-eyed and terrified, scrambled from their bench. They didn't run to Rowan. They ran past him, a small, human wave, and crashed into Maribel. Beau wrapped his arms around her legs. Lark buried her face in her dress, and Renly held up her arms, demanding to be held. Maribel knelt, gathering them all into her embrace, her tears finally falling, hot and cleansing, into their hair. Tanner had held back, as he always did. He stood, his young face a mixture of relief and a dozen other emotions he didn't have names for. He watched her with the children, this woman who had taught him to read, who had stood against the storm, who had faced down their enemies without flinching. He took a slow step forward. Maribel looked up, her eyes meeting his over Beau's tousled head. He swallowed, his throat working, and then he said the one word he had been holding in his heart for months, the one word that meant everything. "Mother." He said it just once. It was quiet, almost a whisper, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. It was enough for a lifetime. Maribel's breath hitched in a sob, and she reached out her free hand, pulling him into the circle, completing their family. The townspeople surged around them, a joyous, backslapping, hand-shaking crowd. Through the throng, Maribel saw Elder Two Branches standing near the door. He did not applaud. He simply watched them, a deep, peaceful smile on his ancient face, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a silent, profound blessing. Rowan pushed a path through the well-wishers, his hand on Maribel's back, guiding her and their children out of the stuffy, emotionally charged room, out onto the courthouse steps, into the light. The air had changed. The long winter was finally, truly over. A warm spring wind, a chinook from the mountains, was blowing through the town, carrying the sweet, earthy smell of thawing soil and new life. The snow was in full retreat, melting in rivulets that ran down the muddy street. The sound a happy, gurgling music. The sky over Dry Willow was a high, brilliant, cloudless blue. Rowan turned to Maribel, the chaos of the cheering crowd fading into a distant hum. His face, which for so long had been a mask of stoic endurance, was transformed. The weariness was gone, replaced by a light that seemed to shine from within. His brown eyes, which had held the long, hard winter, were now filled with the warmth of the spring sun. He took her face in his hands, his rough palms gentle against her skin, and there, on the steps of the courthouse, in front of the entire town, he kissed her. It was not the quiet, questioning kiss of the night before. This was a kiss of absolute certainty, a deep and profound claiming, a public declaration. It was not the end of a long and desperate fight. It was the bold, unapologetic, and triumphant beginning of a shared life. When he finally drew back, she was breathless, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. She looked up at him, at this quiet, solid man who was her home, and a small, wondering laugh escaped her. "I've never been kissed like that," she whispered, her voice full of a happy, dizzying wonder. Rowan's rare, true smile, the one she had only ever seen in glimpses, finally bloomed. Crinkling the corners of his eyes, he leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear, his voice a low, warm promise that was for her and her alone. That, he murmured, was just the start. The crowd cheered, their voices rising to the vast, open sky. He took her hand, and Tanner and Lark and Bo and Renly took theirs, forming a chain. The six of them stood together on the steps, the open road stretching out before them, a path leading not into the lonely, dangerous west of their past, but into a shared, hopeful future. The sounds of the town, the fading hoofbeats of a distant horse, the clear, bright sky over the Dry Willow Basin, it was all as clean and new and full of promise as the first day of creation. Thank you so much for listening to our story today. We would be so grateful if you could take a moment to comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. It's a joy to connect with our audience. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help this story reach even more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.